hear from family housing tenants, DOD, and the private companies on the corrective actions being taken to improve privatized housing and the way forward to sustain the corrective actions. In August 2018, Reuters published the first in a series of articles chronicling health and safety issues experienced by military families living in privatized military family housing. These articles prompted an ever-increasing number of military families from across the country to come forward with their experiences, many of whom I've had the chance to talk to on visits to military bases and seen firsthand the deplorable conditions in some of the housing and how long the conditions were allowed to persist without response from the private companies. The large geographically diverse group of families indicated that there were systemic failures in the privatized military family housing program. Families of all services, ranks, and pay grades have reported health problems related to lead and mold exposure, rodent infestations, rude and dismissive housing management, and ineffective oversight of the program by the services. The following February, I'm sorry, can we close the door? If we need to let people in to fill the seats, I'm sorry. Let me pause for a moment. Okay. Can we bring... Okay. Do we want to just let people in who want to come in? This is everybody who wants to be here? Okay. All right, great. No. Thank you. Apologize. The large geographically diverse group of families indicated that there were systemic failures in the privatized military family housing program. Families of all services, ranks, and pay grades have reported health problems related to lead and mold exposure, rodent infestations, rude and dismissive housing management, and ineffective oversight of the program by the services. The following February, Pentagon officials directed the leaders in their respective services to take immediate action to assess the scale and scope of installation housing issues, to include outreach to military families with the author of housing inspections to help document health and safety concerns. Soon after, the military services began weekly meetings to analyze the data coming back from the field and began to address the systemic issues that were causing the problems being encountered by families. We had a hearing last year during our appropriations process and heard really unfortunate circumstances that were unacceptable and that were mind-blowing to most of the members of the committee, to all of the members of the committee, who just couldn't wrap our minds around the idea that we had so many military families who were neglected and ignored and blown off for so long. It's just an unacceptable situation, and that's why we're going to continue to make sure that we have oversight hearings on the conditions and ensuring that we're riding herd on the implementation of necessary and vital changes. Many of the problems experienced by military families appear to be products of poor management by private partners and insufficient or ineffective oversight by military services, which quite frankly they acknowledged when we had them before us in our hearings last year, the military side. Many military families have complained about the maintenance support they have received from the partners. Family member complaints include the following: general unresponsiveness, long response times, failure to communicate, failure to keep appointments, and failure to adequately address issues which raise health concerns. While the services continue to maintain housing offices, they have reduced the number of personnel that work at these offices. This understaffing is often exacerbated by co-locating the few remaining service housing personnel with the private partner management team, leading to families often feeling uncomfortable about making complaints about the private partner to their service liaisons because they're sitting right there in the same room. I don't understand how that could be that could be helpful or make any sense. Another systemic issue is a lack of involvement and oversight by senior installation leadership and the service member tenants' chain of command. Failure to understand or execute their role in ensuring that service members and their families have adequate housing has contributed to family members believing they have no place to turn for help with housing concerns. The services report that a lack of visibility on work order processing has contributed to the overall lack of oversight. In addition, the current system incentivizes work order completion without respect to the quality of maintenance performed, which has led to poor workmanship and unqualified personnel performing the work. An overemphasis on occupancy rates incentivizes quick turnover of homes, which in turn can lead to a lack of preventive maintenance of homes between tenants. And finally, I recognize that some of our witnesses are parties in ongoing litigation. I do want to remind members to ask their questions while keeping in mind that witnesses might have to limit their responses due to this ongoing litigation. At the same time, this is an important issue, and the committee expects that each witness will endeavor to answer members' questions so we can continue to conduct the essential oversight that is our responsibility. I don't expect today that we will tolerate a lot of answers that refer to a lawsuit and witnesses being unable to answer as a result. But we're going to be sensitive to that, to those issues. We have a lot to cover today. I'm looking forward to a good conversation that will help make sure that we can learn what has been accomplished over the last year and a half and how far we have to go. And at this time, I'd like to yield to my ranking member, Judge Carter, for his opening statement.
Thank the chairwoman for yielding. I'm going to make this short. I look forward to this hearing about changes and improvements made to military family housing over the past year. I also look forward to discussing how the additional $1.41 million of this subcommittee provided in fiscal year 2020 is being used to increase the services' ability to provide oversight and management of their housing portfolios, and what the plans are for the next fiscal year. With that, I thank you and I yield back.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Not seeing Chairwoman Lowy or Ranking Member Granger, we now welcome our first panel. Our witnesses are Colonel Scott Gerber, Ms. Lynn Gerdovich. The witnesses are military individuals or spouses who are current or recent residents in military family housing, and their stories are like many from around the country. They will describe the conditions they encountered, the difficulties they faced in persuading appropriate officials to address serious maintenance issues in their homes, and the problems with the remediation efforts undertaken by the contractors. Because we have 3 panels today, we're limiting the length of the witness testimony, all of the witnesses' testimony, to 3 minutes. So without objection, we'll show that done, and we'll proceed with our first witness. Colonel Gerber, your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you are recognized for 3 minutes to give us a summary.
Councilman Schultz, I'd actually been told I had a 5-minute statement to make.
No, we had to revise that to 3 minutes. So
Okay.
if you can summarize your testimony, and your full testimony will be entered into the record.
Well, you pay me to be flexible, so I will be. Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz and Ranking Member Carter, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Your continued vigilance on the military housing crisis is appreciated. Sandy, my wife, and I lived in Corvius housing on Fort Meade, and we want to share our experiences. Frankly, the fact that the Gerdoviches went through the same thing that we went through a year later, a year after the testimony, a year after the contractors promised to fix this, is shocking. Our message is simple. The military families need a level playing field with the contractors today. We need to do it before another child is exposed to toxic mold, pest infestation, or other hazardous conditions. Giving us a chance to fight for the ones we love requires 3 things. First, full implementation of the Tenant Bill of Rights. Second, expanding the role of military families and advocacy groups in the formal discussion. And third, employing independent inspectors. As my written testimony documents, Sandy and I lived through 2 mold-infested homes where we had mold and insulation blowing on us. We couldn't get acceptable maintenance. Contractors told us that black mold in our house was okay. And as a result, everything we had was covered in mold, and my wife, a former distance runner, now has asthma. Moreover, our situation wasn't unique. A number of families reached out to us. We saw elderly parents and kids living in mold-infested rooms. We sat with one young couple while they realized they had to throw everything they owned away because it was covered in black mold, and then begin everything again, paying out of their own pocket. In a home for a recovering cancer patient, we found the contractor running an industrial air cleaner before a mold test. We hired an independent home inspector, Sandy and I hired, found water damage and toxic levels of mold in 13 of 16 homes, including 6 of 7 homes the contractor had recently built for junior enlisted families. Sandy and I continue to hear problems from families on the installation. As a matter of fact, this morning someone reached out to Sandy. So I would ask that we realize to meet Congress's goals for privatized housing, we have to establish oversight. If we don't establish oversight, money is not going to work. How do we do that? 1, full Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights that was approved is missing the 3 things that tenants need to have level playing field. The ability to withhold BAH, dispute resolution, and a 10-year maintenance. Second, Judge Carter and Congressman Bishop hit the second key in their 2019 Housing Act, which said, bring the families in. Bringing the families into the process, into the formal process, is a game-changing innovation, because in 2018 and 19, we showed we can bring these issues to light. Finally, the government needs to bring in external housing inspectors to give commanders an unbiased assessment, because what we saw in Fort Meade was not unbiased. I've deployed to combat 3 times. I've executed over 400 combat patrols. I carry a list of 42 friends and comrades we lost in combat, 6 of them under my command. So when I see what I saw in Fort Meade, it's personal. We cannot send people into harm's way wondering if their family's in danger from the house they live in. We've got to level the playing field between the families and the private contractors and ensure this doesn't happen again. While the contractors will highlight their investments, I think we can all agree more money is going to achieve little without accountability. Thank you for allowing me to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Colonel Gerber, and you can share more of your testimony with us as we proceed with questions. And you're right, you face enough enemies in combat. Your house shouldn't be among them. I appreciate your remarks, and now I'll recognize Ms. Gerdovich. Your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you're recognized for 3 minutes to summarize your remarks.
Good morning. My name is Lynn Gerdovich. My husband James is an Air Force colonel, and we're the proud parents of 6 children. We're the proud parents of 6 children ranging in age from 1 to 13. We moved to Bowling Air Force Base 6 months ago, so James could enroll in the Senior Executive Development Program at Fort McNair. This was our 14th move in 15 years. We chose to live on base because we thought it would offer an affordable, safe place for our children. We never imagined our home would compromise the health of our family. As I tell our story, please keep in mind my children, especially my youngest son, 2-year-old Rollin. He was born with a condition that happens only once in every 400,000 births. He has cloacal extrophy. Essentially, he was born with his organs, the bladder, intestines, and reproductive organs outside of his body, some split in half and inside out. He has only 1 kidney and is diagnosed with spina bifida. His young life has been a series of surgeries and medical procedures, and he has many more to come as doctors try to give him the life all children deserve. Through it all, he is a vibrant little fighter who brings our family incredible joy. A multidisciplinary team of specialists, including 5 different surgeons, oversee his care at Johns Hopkins Hospital. In order to not have blanks in his medical charts, I am required to be vigilant about his medical history, things that he's been exposed to, so that I'm armed with the ability to answer any questions that come my way from the many different specialists and doctors we deal with. The home we leased in September on Bowling Air Force Base smelled foul the moment we moved in. Within days, all my children developed respiratory symptoms. The younger ones, like Rollin, had hacking coughs and constant congestion. My 9-month-old baby Ansel endured a fever that reached 104.5 degrees. Suspecting mold, we asked Hunt to come test our home. Despite their moisture meter signaling high levels of moisture, they dismissed this to temperature and told us our home was safe. After learning our house had never been approved for occupancy, Base Command came by to inspect, but they were forced outside by what they experienced inside. The vice commander's eyes were watery and she was dizzy. She said, "There's something bad inside your house," and ordered a third-party inspection to come properly test for mold. The day prior to that inspection, however, Hunt scrambled to clean our entire duct system, thick with dust, and completely replace both our furnace and HVAC system. The third party they hired reported back to them, not me, so it was almost 2 more weeks before I learned that the bathrooms did in fact require extensive mold remediation. After being told it would take a week, we were put into temporary housing for what ended up being a little more than 2 months. Our family of 8 was in a 3-bedroom home. 2 of our children slept on a mattress on the floor in the dining room. We asked Hunt to test for the mold type, and they refused. This was important for my son, Rollin. Ignoring my pleas to then just preserve samples so we could test, Hunt quickly and conveniently disposed of the bulk of the materials before I could hire my own inspector to sample them. Our inspector, however, still was able to determine that our home's extensive mold contamination included Stachybotrys and Aspergillus penicillium. According to the World Health Organization, these molds can produce mycotoxins that cause adverse health effects ranging from acute poisoning to immune deficiency and cancer. More alarmingly, our inspector found Hunt also botched the remediation effort by ignoring and mishandling of asbestos tiles our inspector found in the bathroom. Failed containment efforts exposed our possessions, toys, photo albums, furniture, In school books, I used to homeschool our children to carcinogens. When they finally did an air test, they covered our goods in plastic, rendering the test invalid. Our belongings are still in that home. Hunt has fought us the entire way on replacement costs of the last items, offering us only a fraction of the replacement value. I worry about the young airmen that can't afford to pay the $2,700 out of pocket like we did to have these tests to prove what Hunt's doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gurdovich. And I'm sorry for what your family has had to go through. Again, your house should not be your enemy. And I thank both of the witnesses for your remarks. We'll proceed in the standard 5-minute rounds, alternating sides, recognizing members in order of seniority as they were seated at the beginning of the hearing. And each member should be mindful of your time and allow the witnesses time to answer questions within your 5-minute turn. And I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Georgia because he has to go chair his own hearing at 11 o'clock. So, Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. I thank the chair for yielding to me and for your courtesy. I do have to go and preside at another hearing that's simultaneously scheduled. But Colonel Gerber and Ms. Gurdovich, thank you for your testimony. It's enlightening and insightful to hear from you. And we really regret what you've suffered through dealing with private housing providers. But rest assured that the committee and the members of Congress are here to support you, and we want to ensure that your voices are heard. Let me just ask you, what, if any, meaningful changes you feel that the housing providers have already accomplished, if any? And do you feel that they're addressing the problem, or you think that they are sort of holding you off to wait to see what the committee will do, or the Department of Defense will do, just to try to, I guess, keep you at bay? And tell me if you believe that the burden is with the housing providers to make improvements, or do you believe that there needs to be more involvement from DOD and individual installation commands? Just for background, I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Military Family Caucus, along with Congresswoman Catherine Lamars Rogers of the state of Washington. And each year we hold a summit to meet with stakeholders and families to hear issues that affect military families. And this year I want to invite you to come and to share your story and your experiences in this situation with others. You've both been very firm advocates for the expansion of military family tenant rights, and I appreciate that very much. And I'd like to know if there are any additional things that you think that we can do to give tenants a voice and the ability to control the outcomes. So please, have at it.
Thank you, Congressman Bishop. And again, thank you for the bill you sponsored last year that emphasized the importance of military families. And I think the first thing we can do to improve the situation is to bring military families into the formal process, military families and advocacy groups. I mean, MFAN, Military Family Advocacy Network, did great work. I think the second thing we would ask for Congress to do is to continue the fire until this Bill of Rights gets done. Right now, we've got to give service members control of their BAH so that they are the ones that are in control, that they have the ability to hold the contractor accountable when they fail to perform. They need a dispute resolution process, and I need to speak up, and they need an easy mechanism to stop that BAH. Finally, the maintenance is important. We're coming up on, the maintenance history is important. We're coming up on the summer PCS season. Had we known that 4542 had a history of water damage and mold, Sandy and I would not have gone into that house. And so while the companies will talk about investment, my written testimony talks about what we saw when Corvius brought in a third-party contractor, and it wasn't very, it caused concerns about the quality of that inspection. So there have been some improvements, but I think we need to be very skeptical of the work we've seen and demand external accountability, not someone that the contractor hired.
I appreciate that very much, and I'd like to again invite you to share with us at the Congressional Military Family Caucus Summits, because I'm certain that the issues that you face are not unique just to you and your families, and we want to make sure that we address it once and for all, and we put in place some mechanism to make sure that we can keep a lid on this.
Ms. Gurdovich, she may want to respond. You still have time.
I would echo that. Independent inspectors would do wonders that report back to the tenant instead of the privatized companies. I spent much of my time overseeing the job because information was withheld from me. So if you had truly independent inspectors, I do believe it's improved. These companies have a quicker response time. I believe they're trying to do that, but it doesn't mean that they're actually fixing the problem properly when they do respond. So for instance, our home had very little visible mold. In fact, just a little bit of mildew, yet all of our bathrooms ended up being gutted. And the only reason we knew that was because our kids were getting sick. So what would I believe be an incredible improvement and would be able to give, something that would be able to give families peace of mind would be to do air quality testing, something that these companies absolutely refuse to do. If I know I'm moving into a home, there is no way I know that it's safe because of the history of what they've done to cover these problems up. And the only thing that assures me that my children would be safe would be an air quality test that would test for those things, the environmental hazards.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Judge Carter?
Thank you. And I may be asking some questions you don't know the answer to, and I don't know the answer to them. What contractual obligation does the contractor have to you as the tenant? Or to the government as somebody wrote a contract to build these houses. And what kind of maintenance obligation do they have under contract? Or do you know?
The privatized companies or the subcontractors they hire to fix the job?
Both.
So, Judge Carter, I would tell you a couple of things. One, you sign a standard contract with the housing provider, but as the tenant, you have no ability to enforce that contract because you can't stop rent. You can't go to a judge and ask them to stop rent payment or force them to fix things. You can't you can't break the contract and say, I'm out of this and stop paying rent. Your money keeps going to them. So while there's a contract, and in that contract it says that the house is supposed to be up to local housing codes, there's no way for the tenant to enforce that. There's also contracts with the government, but those are guarded and placed under proprietary information. When families have FOIA'd that document, they've gotten heavily redacted documents under the claim that there's proprietary information. So again, these are all efforts that prevent Congress from exercising good oversight and the families from being on a level playing field.
So it would be your argument that the military is obligated to defend your rights.
Judge Carter, General Perna mentioned in his interview last week, he said soldiers have got to go to the chain of command, and he's right. I was a squadron commander in Fort Hood, and I failed soldiers because there's a problem there and I didn't realize it. But the chain of command's got to be the exception. These are busy people. The people at Fort Meade and NSA are doing vital work to our national interests. And so the families need to be able to take care of themselves, and the chain of command should be a last-ditch effort. Right now, we've got that inverted. And the other point I would make is these young families are very hesitant to go to the chain of command, especially a young spouse. I'm a colonel in the Army. I was friends with Sergeant Major of the Army daily. I called him up. I was like, Sergeant Major, you got to look at this. This is awful. A private doesn't have that kind of relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you both, which was supposed to be my last question, but I'm going to ask it first because it's a tough question, and I think it's the overarching question that has to be answered. Do you think that privatizing military housing was a good idea? And do you think these issues would either not have come up, been handled better, if the housing was never privatized and instead owned and managed by the military?
Okay, so Chairwoman, I'll lead off. I think it was a good idea. There are a lot of people who say we should go back to military housing. And Second Lieutenant Gerber remembers the disaster that housing was on Fort Bliss. And then in 2001, as part of the privatization, the National Military Family Association testified in front of this committee, and they highlighted that there was like $16 billion in maintenance that would take the government to work 30 30 years to work through. So privatization brought in a huge influx of capital that is allowing the modernization of homes. What we didn't quite get it right. We failed to establish correct oversight, and these companies took advantage of it. So rather than going back to a failed model, let's use the leverage we have on these companies to force them to renegotiate the contract, incorporate the Tenant Bill of Rights, and let's get on with giving our families decent housing instead of arguing over whether I should be able to withhold my BAH.
Do you agree?
I
It's okay if you don't.
yes, if there is proper oversight, then I agree that the military needs to spend its time doing other things, and it's a good solution to have someone else manage it if they can manage it properly. But in the face of all of these failures, it's hard to say that it's been a good idea.
So we did fund a layer of oversight that did not exist before, so hopefully that will at least be beginning to help. But now that I asked the overarching question and got that out of the way, I want to ask you some more detailed questions. Both of you mentioned working with outside inspectors. Did you encounter pushback in bringing in outside home inspectors, and what was the cost to you and your family for that inspection?
We absolutely had to bring in an outside inspector because from the beginning, before remediation went underway, I made it very clear that the thing that was the most important to me was to get samples for the type of mold that our kids had been exposed to. I even wrote an email the morning that the construction crew told me they were going to begin cleanup to the head of Hunt Maintenance, and I asked him to please just...
Was there any pushback, though, in you bringing in an outside inspector, or were you just able to do that?
He said I could do that under his authority if they let them in the house and he was there. But I...
The person from the company.
The private, yeah, the Hunt said that,
Mhm.
the private inspector. I had already gotten him inside the house and tested before he responded to me with that. But we had to pay $2,700 on the spot to get that testing, and that's testing that they still refuse to reimburse us for.
Ma'am, our experience with private inspections is the reason we're convinced that that's got to be part of a three-legged, a three-legged oversight that includes Tenant Bill of Rights, independent inspections, and bringing the families into formal processes.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't ask, we just did it. I mean, I'm a colonel, I can get away with that.
Right.
And so he was the person who found the mold that was blowing on my wife and I for months. And then as I said, we brought him in to look at 16 other homes for families, and he found levels of mold that were just astronomical. And what that did was it gave those families ammunition to go back to Corvius and say, look, this house is contaminated, and there wasn't any debate about it.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't get any pushback. I think, the military leaders I dealt with appreciated that we put some science behind this. And it really convinced me that having an independent inspection regime is critical for this. And my wife refuses to tell me how much we spent on the inspections.
It's the
Before
only
my-
reason they're listening to us,
Yeah.
I believe.
It is. It's the only reason they listen.
Excuse me. Before my time expires, how confident are you in the quality of the repair work and remediation that's been done in your homes?
Very not confident at all. I stood outside my house throughout the process to watch things happen. They did an air quality test in which they were going to tell us that our belongings were safe after they aggressively stirred up the asbestos fibers to see if they were in the air. But before they did that, I took a picture to show that they had finally ventilated the air to the outside instead of the inside. And we noticed in that picture later that the goods that they were testing to see if they had been exposed to asbestos had all been covered with plastic prior to the testing. It was only when I pointed this out to Hunt that they agreed that they had many points of failure and finally offered to replace our things. If I wasn't there, they would have never caught this and called our goods safe to bring home to my kids.
Okay.
Chairwoman,
My time's expired so quickly.
I'd agree too, because our written testimony documents a number of dubious practices, both with remediation of our house and with the families we helped. There is a persistent pattern of really inadequate or incompetent remediation.
Thank you. Mr. Rutherford?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you repeat the three legged stool that you're talking about to fix this? You mentioned the third-party inspection report.
Yes, sir. Based on our experience, we think there's three things. One, you need the full tenant bill of rights. The document that was released last week misses the three things that the service members need to be able to fight an even footing, to force the contractor to meet their contractual obligations. Second, you need to bring in independent inspectors. As both Lynn and I have talked about, the only way we got leverage, and the only way we got leverage for a dozen families on Fort Meade, was bringing someone from the outside in who was calling balls and strikes as opposed to what the contractor wanted to hear. I would also add that managing a billion-dollar housing project without outside inspection on a regular basis doesn't pass the common sense test. The third thing is, and Congressman Carter and Congressman Bishop really hit this in 2019, we saw that the families can be a game-changing innovation in oversight, because if they believe they'll be listened to, they'll come forward and they'll highlight the problems and they'll get it out there. On the other hand, it's the military. If they don't think they're being listened to, they're just going to shut up and color, because it's what we do. It's our culture.
You mentioned earlier, back in '96, when they were about to make this change, that there was, did you say $30 million or $30 billion worth of work?
Sir, according to the National Military Family Association testimony in 2001 in front of this committee, I believe they identified $16 billion in maintenance that was required to bring the homes up to standard.
And are there any reports or studies out there to show how that has moved forward? Is it better now or worse now, or do we know?
I don't think we know, Congressman. And again, this is another advantage of the Tenant Bill of Rights. If these kids could actually come forward and fight, and they had a dispute resolution mechanism, all of a sudden you'd start generating data that this committee could use in its oversight role.
Okay. And I would suggest too that if you're going to use these independent inspectors, it ought to be pre and post. It ought to be what's happening in your home now, and then after they remediate, they ought to be going back, testing it again. It's not a one-time thing, and then they remediate, and then the assumption is that they've taken care of everything. Now they should have to show you that they've taken care of everything.
They show you with their
Did
own
they do that?
But they show that with their own hired subcontractors, ones that have proven to not be trustworthy and have falsified reports. So our own inspector wasn't invited back. In fact, we were told it was a conflict of interest for him to come.
And clearly that's something that I think we need to look at as a committee. And in the Bill of Rights, the Tenant Bill of Rights that was just discussed, last week, I think. Have you had a chance to review that yet?
Yes, sir. So the Secretary Esper passed out the Bill of Rights with the rights he was able to get completed. 3 critical rights were missing. The dispute resolution process, so if I have an argument with my housing provider, there's a process for me to go and get that adjudicated by an independent party.
Right.
The ability to withhold BAH. So the problem is, if they don't follow the contract,
Yeah.
Even if I break my contract, they still get my rent. So BAH withholding, and then a 10-year maintenance history. Particularly given the history of these homes' maintenance, the Bill of Rights that was supposed to be passed should have given them access to the last 10 years, so you can see, do you have a home with a history of mold or a history of water or something like that? We've
Kind of like
got,
to do with automobiles.
yes, sir. We've got to get this fixed. This is, and the military wants it, Congress wants it, and the family wants it. So I would argue we could use some help influencing the last group of people to come along and get it done.
And if it has no history, then they can do these things like the air quality tests
Mm-hmm. To show you.
to show that it's safe, because they haven't kept records. And let me
Thank-
clarify
thank-
my last question.
Sure.
He could come out, they just wouldn't pay for him to come, and we weren't ready to spend another almost $3,000.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Case?
Colonel, can I just go back to Mr. Rutherford's questions? Because I want to focus in on what your actual recommendations are and how they would change this current situation. So I'm just going to tick off your issues here and make sure I understand them. So I think I'm pretty straight on withholding the BH. That's not an option today, right?
No, sir.
It goes straight from the military to the contractor.
Right, and the
So-
service member has no ability to turn it off.
Okay. Are there situations where the military itself does not pay that over to the contractor? So in other words, do they have the option of doing that if they
No,
have
sir.
a master, under, as far as you know, under the master contracts the military has with?
In my case, to get my rent turned off, I had to go to the garrison commander, another colonel, and he had to go to Corvius and twist their arm to get them to turn off my payment of them.
I'm sorry, so who turned off your payment?
Corvius turned off my allotment to give them my rent. The garrison commander couldn't do it, and I couldn't do it. Corvius had to turn it off.
Okay,
That's the critical point. If I have a dispute with a landlord on the economy, I say I'm breaking the lease and I walk away and stop paying him. So he has incentive to meet me halfway.
Correct.
That doesn't exist.
okay. And similarly, just so I'm clear, what doesn't exist is the ability of your garrison commander to turn it off, either if your garrison commander agrees with you that something is amiss.
Correct, sir.
Okay. And then dispute resolution, do you have kind of a more detailed sense of what kind of resolution that would be? Would it be, binding arbitration? Would it be, you
Sir,
just
I
want to
think-
kick it into a third-party atmosphere, right?
Yes, sir. And I think if you have a dispute with a landlord in, say, Fairfax County where I live, I can go to the county, I can go through the courts. There are a number of mechanisms. None of that exists for a service member. And so in our case, we ended up in front of the garrison commander, and he looked at me, he's like, Scott, I really don't know, I don't have any authority, and I don't know how to make heads or tails out of the story that's in front of me.
Okay. And then, I'm sorry, I missed the third one. You're talking about a 10-year, what
So
was that again?
the third element missing out of the Bill of Rights is the 10-year history. So there was the contractors were supposed to give families a 10-year history on the home. So in our
Oh, I
case,
see.
since my wife has mold allergies, if they had told us the house had been filled with mold in the past and had water damage, we would have kept looking.
Okay, so what is your understanding of that seems to be a pretty simple thing, relatively simple thing to provide. It's just an inventory on, I presume, complaints on the home, improvements on the home. I mean, do you have a sense of why that is not something that's pretty routine?
No, I do not, sir.
Anybody ever said, this is why we don't want to do that?
No, sir.
Okay. And then bring families in. What do you exactly mean by that? I mean, are you talking about the kind of a family representation in terms of the relationship between the military and the privatized housing contractor, or between the contractor and where would the families come in and how?
Sir, I think you need to bring the families in formally on a couple different levels. One, we have a long tradition of having village mayors. Each little housing group would have a mayor, and then they would come together and be a rapid point to get issues resolved with garrison or the contractor. Right now, we have post-town halls. What I would ask is, if we have public-private ventures, why don't we form a board of directors that involves the military, the contractor, and these mayors, and give them power to influence, awards and things like that. And then out of that group, people like General Perna or the secretary could bring members or folks like the VFW into negotiations with the partner, and I think it'd be very powerful for them if the contractors start talking about things and you have families who are representing the tenants, you have real-time information in that. So when we talk about fix the tenant bill of rights, do independent inspections, and bring families into the formal process, the first three things you talked about are fixing the tenant bill of rights. The last two are the other two legs of that stool that I think gives you good oversight of the
Correct.
problem.
I get it. Okay, and then just external housing inspectors, I completely understand the perspective on that. When would you envision that would be advisable? Like at the beginning of the tenancy, or as soon as there's a complaint, or I'm just sorting out how that would actually look in practice.
Representative, I think it would happen in two different places. One is if you have one of these disputes, all of a sudden you have a third-party qualified inspector. Second, when you're handling something like, I think there's about 2,000 homes on Fort Meade, randomly sample a percentage of them every year and see if what we're getting reported is accurate. I mean, this is just basic project management.
Okay. And then I guess my final I'm not sure how much time I have. Okay, I will cease then. Sorry.
Thank you. All the members had an opportunity to ask questions, and I think it's very clear what the path forward is and what some of the glaring neglect has resulted in. You gave us some good food for thought and very specific suggestions. Clearly, the other three, Tenants' Bill of Rights, certainly should be added to the Bill of Rights already approved. Everything you've suggested to me is certainly reasonable. It's outrageous that this was allowed to happen in the first place, which is what prompted my question, of course. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, because I was wrapping up. Yes, Judge Carter.
Are these units new construction or rehab? The old buildings that they went in and rehabbed, or are they new construction?
Judge, what we saw on Fort Meade was both. So for instance, the housing inspector Sandy and I hired looked at 7 new construction and found toxic levels of mold and water damage in 6 of them. The other 16 homes, so whatever 7 minus 16 is, were older construction. 9.
Thank you.
Questions of the tenant? Yes. Okay. Since Congressman Ryan just came in, I want to give him an opportunity to ask the housing residents a question. Mr. Ryan, you're recognized. Sorry to go to you right as you're sitting down, but we were about to wrap up.
Yeah. Get my bearings here.
I've
for a
been there,
second.
sorry.
I apologize, Chairwoman, that I'm late.
Oh, that's okay, no problem. I just didn't want to wrap up without giving you an opportunity.
You know what, Madam Chair, I'll pass and I'll submit any questions for the record.
Okay, okay.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah, of course, no problem. So as I was saying, trust me when I tell you that we are going to stay on top of this. You know, we initially had a hearing with the service representatives. We will be able to ask them questions. The way we're doing the hearings this year is we're having each service come separately for their own hearing, because we thought we could drill down more specifically with each of the services that way, and not really have to ask all of these questions to a whole panel of people across the services. And you know, as we develop our work product, we'll include additional accountability to the degree that we can, and resources if necessary. And we have a full set of panels today, both the private companies after you and and the government following them. So thank you for your service, Colonel. Thank you for your family's service and your husband. And appreciate you appearing before the committee today, sharing the many other families' issues on their behalf. So we're going to allow for a few minutes for the panels to switch out, and for us to switch out the audience members as well. So the subcommittee will stand in recess briefly for that purpose.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
The committee will come back to order. We'll now welcome our second panel. Our witnesses are Mr. Rick Taylor, President, Facility Operations, Renovations, and Construction, Balfour Beatty Communities, Mr. Heath Burleson, Corvius Partnership Advisor, Mr. Dennis Hickey, CEO of Lead Lease Americas, Mr. John Ali, President of Hunt Military Communities, and, Mr. John Ale, and Mr. Jeff Guild, Vice President, Lincoln Military Housing. The witnesses will provide testimony on their efforts to improve the conditions in privatized military family housing and answer questions about how we could have had the problems that have surmounted over the last number of years in the first place. In addition, they will provide details on their ongoing actions to remedy the inadequate management of the program, improvements they have already instituted, and longer-term process improvements that will be implemented in the coming months. Mr. Taylor, we'll start with you, and then we'll go down the table. All of the witnesses' full written testimony will be entered into the record, and each of you will be recognized for 3 minutes and to summarize your remarks. So, Mr. Taylor, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Rick Taylor, and I'm co-president of Balfour Beatty Communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We are committed to providing our nation's servicemen and women and their families safe, quality, and responsive professional property management. We have been actively participating in the meetings with the Department of Defense to help implement the MHPI provisions under the FY20 NDAA, and we support the Tenant Bill of Rights and pledge to continue to work with DoD to develop uniform policies regarding these matters. In addition to the reforms outlined in the NDAA, we are actively exploring innovative ways to enhance the long-term financial viability of the MHPI, including OMB scoring of new projects and project refinancing, leveraging reinvestment account deposits, and basic allowance for housing rate stabilization. As a company, we have learned a lot, and we are committing to making things right. I would like to highlight some of the changes we have implemented to enhance our operations and our residents' daily living experience. First, we have reorganized. This includes my appointment as co-president and with specific responsibility for facility operations, renovations, and construction. As a former Navy Civil Engineer Corps officer, I am especially sensitive to the types of challenges and concerns associated with military housing, and I am fully committed to providing and implementing solutions. We have also recently appointed a Senior Vice President of Transformation. He is tasked to lead a review of our operating procedures and put in place a comprehensive change management program. Second, we have radically adjusted our approach to maintenance and customer service to include the identification and management of environmental hazards. We've augmented our local teams by hiring third-party specialist contractors for HVAC, environmental remediation, and industrial hygiene. We have delivered exceptional customer service training to our employees to reemphasize our commitment to best practice and high standards. And we have delivered code of conduct training to our employees to underscore the importance we place on integrity and ethics. Finally, we have introduced a more robust performance metric tracking and reporting across our entire portfolio, including resident satisfaction, work orders, displaced residents, preventive maintenance, occupancy, and staffing levels. We are also empowering our residents by providing with greater transparency into and control over the work order process. These efforts are just the beginning. We acknowledge there is more to do, and our teams are continuing to collaborate with all stakeholders to deliver ongoing improvements. Our residents deserve the best, and we're committed to delivering for them. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Hickey?
Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, my name is Dennis Hickey. I'm CEO of Lend Lease America. Look, Lend Lease is proud to be working with the Department of Defence and the key committees of Congress and also the military families. Madam Chairwoman, the issues being discussed here today are critical for Lend Lease and for me personally. No family, much less a military family, should live in substandard conditions. We have the privilege of overseeing 40,000 homes with 132,000 residents across 28 installations in the US. And we welcome the support that Congress has given over the past 12 months to try and improve the military housing initiative. There are many efforts that have been set by Congress that are underway. One of those efforts involved the NDAA reforms, and we at Lend Lease are committed to implementing all of those reforms as outlined in the NDAA language. Another important military housing initiative actually came from this very committee, which is the appropriation of $140 million for new housing inspectors. This will no doubt go a long way to seeing the oversight as requested under the NDAA language. Madam Chairman, we are proud of the work we do at Lendlease, but realise that we can and must do more. For example, Lendlease currently processes over 400,000 service orders a year across our bases. Our statistics show that 97% of these service orders are completed in time and within resident satisfaction. However, 3% of these are obviously not. And it's that 3% that I am particularly focused upon. Our goal is to improve all aspects of our operation and to ensure that the families can live in safe and affordable housing. To do that, over the past 12 months, we've taken a number of steps. Firstly, we've revolutionised our customer service. We've added new staff, new suppliers, contractors, instituted training programs across all of our maintenance people to improve their skills. Secondly, we've been the first to implement a smartphone app more than 2 years ago. That perfecting this is still an ongoing requirement for our team. It contains easy information for our residents and gives them easy access to log complaints and log requests. Thirdly, we're working with material companies to better install new preventative methods across all of our housing product. And fourthly, we're investing in digital technology that can better analyse data analytics and get to preventative maintenance issues. And finally, Madam Chairwoman, I am particularly proud of the implementation of new residents advisory boards across all of our military bases. These boards are set up in such that each village has a representative for circa 300 to 400 homes. That representative is elected by those 300 or 400 people. Across the base, those representatives then come together to form a residents board, and we as Lendlease, along with the garrison, sit on that board. That board meets monthly, discusses the performance of the base, and also raises any key issues. That board has been rolled out across all of our installations as improving to be effective.
Thank you, Mr. Hickey.
Thank you.
Mr. Burleson.
Chairwoman Wasserman-Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, and Subcommittee members, it is my privilege to provide testimony about the Military Housing Privatization Initiative. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. In my remarks, I will touch upon 3 topics. First, what are we doing to address the resident service issues? Second, what the future holds for the MHPI program, including ongoing challenges like maintaining aging homes and funding reductions. Third, what is necessary to ensure MHPI is a healthy, sustainable program that meets the housing needs of service members for many years to come. Together with our armed service partners, we have made significant improvements to how we operate, how we serve residents, and how we take care of homes. Our call centers are localized, our resident portal, and mobile work order app allow multiple ways to track and submit service requests and provide feedback. In the month of January 2020, we received a resident satisfaction score of 93% on those work orders. We've also carefully reviewed all of our environmental, health, and safety policies, confirming that they meet industry standards. We are working closely with our partners and other MHPI participants to develop standardized policies and procedures across all of these areas. We have added more than 125 permanent positions focused on staying in touch with our residents and responding to service requests. Corvius fully supports all elements of the Tenant Bill of Rights, and we are committed to implementing all of them in conjunction with our military partners. Corvius recently spearheaded the first of its kind direct investment of private capital into our Army partnerships, injecting $325 million for construction and renovation work at no cost to the government. We are close to finalizing an additional $157 million to modernize even more homes. This effort will result in the improvement of nearly 18,000 homes across the portfolio. However, there is still much more work to be done. Without the right level of BH increases, the MHPI partnership's economic model gets out of balance, an untenable situation for delivering today's needs while saving for tomorrow's. The MHPI partnership's reinvestment reserves alone are insufficient to fully address immediate needs, and without action and working together to enable innovative solutions, those needs will remain largely unaddressed and grow exponentially. It's important we work together to make it easier for the MHPI program to attract outside capital. Specifically, if OMB were to revert to its original scoring methodology for MHPI project financing, it would facilitate longer-term debt and make it significantly easier to bring in additional non-government dollars. As the members know, a member of today's first panel is a plaintiff in a pending lawsuit that was recently filed against our partnership with the Army at Fort Meade. Therefore, I hope the members will understand that this hearing is not appropriate forum for any further discussion regarding matters that are part of the pending litigation, and that I will not be able to address those matters here today. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Guild.
Thank you. Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Judge Carter, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of Lincoln Military Housing, thank you for the opportunity to testify before your subcommittee today. My name is Jeff Guild. I have spent my life in service to our nation, first as a son of a retired Army officer growing up in pre-privatized military housing, then for 20 years as a Navy SEAL, and now I proudly continue that service as Vice President for Lincoln Military Housing. Our company welcomes this subcommittee's oversight of the Military Housing Privatization Initiative. We hope you share our view that despite recent challenges, the MHPI is a valuable program that has improved the overall quality of military housing compared to the DoD-managed housing of the last century. The MHPI companies are a partnership between the branches of the armed forces and development companies with experience in real estate management in the residential sector. Under the MHPI, these companies carry out the day-to-day tasks of building, maintaining, and improving military houses. Over the past few years, our company has listened carefully to the concerns some families have expressed about the quality of their housing. More than 1,200 LMH employees, like myself, are veterans, military spouses, or have service members in their families. We wake up every day to serve our resident families with honor and integrity. But it is obvious that some of our families feel we have come up short. Our company has previously apologized to our military families for the times that we have failed to live up to expectations, and I reiterate that sentiment again here today. Beginning in 2017 and working with military families and advocacy organizations, LMH undertook a holistic review of our policies and procedures to explore how we could improve. We identified, developed, and implemented several reforms to address two main goals. The first was to improve the quality of our homes and services, and the second goal was to make reforms that reestablish a culture of trust, transparency, and dialogue with our residents. I am pleased that as I sit here today, many reforms have been implemented. We are in the process of making further reforms, a number of which are being developed and implemented with our service branch partners consistent with the FY 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. Together with DoD, LMH is working as expeditiously as possible to put structure around the dozens of complex provisions in the privatized housing section of the NDAA. As your subcommittee examines how our PPVs are performing and what resources may be needed to carry out the NDAA, I look forward to working with you and our DoD partners to explore new and creative ways to improve our military families' experience in our housing. We understand that the issues are not just about fixing drywall, but repairing a culture of trust with our residents, a culture that recognizes the dignity of their service to our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guild. Mr. Ale?
Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, good morning. My name is John Ale. I'm president of Hunt Military Communities. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. At Hunt, we are proud to serve America's military families. We are entrusted to build quality communities for them, and we take that responsibility very seriously. During the Senate hearing in February last year, it became clear to us that there were families living in our homes whose voices had not been heard. We lost their trust, we're sorry, and we want to get it right. We have heard our residents loud and clear. We are listening, and we are better for it. Over the past year, we have worked diligently on rebuilding the trust between Hunt and our residents and improving their living experience. First, we recognize that quality homes and resident services depend on open and regular communications with our residents. We need to hear from all of our military families to address their concerns. We have taken action to make it easier for our residents to communicate with us. Also, we appreciate that maintenance is a critical part of providing quality homes. Last year, it became clear to us that we had to improve and do better by our residents. While maintenance issues will inevitably arise, it is our goal to provide professional, transparent, and timely service. To achieve this goal, we have enhanced maintenance processes, added key positions, and improved training. Finally, we support reforms to ensure the long-term success of the MHPI program, such as the Resident Bill of Rights. We look forward to working together to provide a better experience for the men and women who protect this country. We are by no means perfect, and there have been times when we have fallen short of our residents' expectations. We are committed to rebuilding their trust in us. We have made progress over the past year, but our work is not done. Before I close, I do want to acknowledge the Gurdovich family represented here this morning. we greatly appreciate and respect Colonel Gerdovich's service and the sacrifice his family makes every day in defense of our country.
Colonel Gerber?
Gerdovich.
Okay.
I listened to Ms. Gerdovich's testimony this morning. I was deeply disturbed by what I heard. No family should have to experience what was described this morning. I will be directly reviewing this case, and I'm committed to addressing the remaining concerns of the family. Thank you for inviting me here to testify today. I look forward to engaging with you on this important topic and answering any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Ale, and I appreciate your comments about the Gerdovich family. That's part of why we have these hearings, so that we can make sure that we can give voice to people who haven't had their voices heard. So I asked the first panel whether they thought, an overarching question about whether they thought that privatizing military family housing was a good idea initially. And I'm going to assume, given that you all build military family housing, that the answer to that question from you is yes. And that wouldn't be surprising, because essentially the system was set up as a gravy train for each of your companies, for all of the companies that have benefited and put money, millions and millions of dollars in your pockets in profit. Nothing wrong with profit, but that occurred without a way for military families to hold you accountable because of the way the contracts are structured. It is outrageous and unacceptable, and all of your testimony is very nice now, but we should not be at this place. These are all, everything you've said today should have been the policies that you had in place to begin with. So if privatized housing was such a great idea, how and why could you let military family housing under this program become so dilapidated and neglected, and then in turn not respond to the concerns and issues raised by families in a timely manner? It is our duty to provide for the service members and their families an optimal place to live, no matter where they are stationed, and they already face enemies on behalf of this country. Their house should not be another enemy that they face. Deplorable housing conditions affect the readiness of a soldier and puts an additional stress on the families that remain behind. So I'd like to know how it is, from each of you, that we could be in this place and that you could have so badly neglected your responsibility to these residents. And we'll start with you, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I guess, as I expressed in my opening remarks, you know, I've come into this role as a consequence of the challenges that the industry has faced and what we personally have faced in this industry. And so while I'm probably not the best person to respond to that in terms of how we got to where we are, what I can tell you is that when we recognize our shortcomings, we knew as an organization that we needed to act swiftly.
Okay, Mr. Taylor, well, I hope you can answer that question for the record. I realize you weren't there from when during the time that these problems occurred, but if you could answer my question for the record, that would be great. Another issue that I want to raise is that I find it shocking that someone on this panel would suggest that the solution to these problems that we increase the BAH. You took these contracts and you decided to build military family housing, knowing what the BAH was, knowing that knowing exactly what the formula was, and to come here and suggest that it's just that our tenants aren't paying you enough money for you to be able to do right by them is really mind-blowing. We certainly do have to change the BAH, particularly because of the difference in cost of living where people live. But I hope you're not suggesting, Mr. Burleson, that that is what the solution is to put more money in your company's pocket.
Madam Chair, no, ma'am. That is not what we're suggesting. What we are suggesting with the comment about BAH is in order to attract outside capital to significantly improve the housing stock and the aging infrastructure, we need to figure out some form of a stabilization of the BAH. We're not necessarily asking for additional BAH to come in, but in order to make it an attractive investment for the outside markets, we need to be able to figure out a way collectively to manage that BAH volatility.
But presumably, you are already bringing in enough resources to be able to take care of the problems and not ignore the residents as your company and other companies have done. Mr. Hickey, if you could answer my initial question, please.
Thanks, Congresswoman. Yeah, I am of the view that the military privatisation initiative has been wildly successful. I think that it has delivered a lot of improvements right across the board.
And how did we get to this point?
I think at the end of the day, you know, in the context, as I said before, We've got a percentage of residents that have not been heard and haven't had the structure to be able to be heard. And I think that what we need to do is to create a framework where those percentage of people who aren't
It's a
happy.
pretty broad and large percentage. This is just not, your testimony referenced tiny percentages, and that's not the evidence that newspaper articles and our oversight and the military itself have revealed.
Yes, Congresswoman, I think that we need to get back and we need to get to the real data of that. And I think at the end of the day, we actually are very focused on trying to improve
But why
that
weren't
percentage.
you responsive to
I think
residents'
we were
needs?
responsive to that. We need to get better at doing that. I think
Much better.
technology, I think we acknowledge that, and we've acknowledged that on several occasions that we need to get better at that, and we
Okay,
need to get
thank
better
you.
at technology and,
Mr. Guile?
and hearing.
I think the way we got here, Madam Chair, is collectively losing sight what was important. Historically, I wasn't there, but understanding the way this, having lived in base housing pre-privatization and now being involved with it professionally post, I think there was a time when this first happened that everything was operating properly in the way it was supposed to. And I think what we've come to at this point is we've just collectively, us and our DoD partners, who I think would agree, have drifted away from the systems and the oversight that we had. And that's what we're working diligently with the DoD to improve and get back to through the NDAA and the Bill of Rights. And that's what I
appreciate that acknowledgement, but if the companies just do the right thing and take care of the residents and have a system in place that is responsive, then DoD shouldn't really need to apply much oversight. They should certainly be responsible, but your job is to be responsible. Thank you. Mr. Ale?
Chairwoman, there's certainly been cases where we've fallen short of expectations, and we're working to improve on those things. I would say that.
But how did that happen? Isn't it your natural responsibility as a company to take care of the residents who are your tenants?
Yep,
That's your job.
And we've had locations that have been very successful at it, and some locations that haven't, and it
So
really
was it
is.
a lack of oversight on your administration's part? What was it?
Some of it is a people element, where we've been successful. We've had really strong people on site. We've had really strong partnerships with commands and military housing offices, and we've had very good relationships with our residents. And in the places where we have not been as successful, we've lacked those areas. We've had to look for lessons learned from those places where we are successful to implement them in places where we've not. I would also say that the program is now 24 years old, and it is time to reform the program and make sure that it is poised to be the success that it needs to be for the coming X number of years. And we are very supportive of the reforms that were outlined in the NDAA.
Thank you. Just as my time expires, a yes or no question from all of you. Do you support the full Tenants' Bill of Rights, adding the 3 elements of the Tenants' Bill of Rights that are not currently included?
We do, Congresswoman.
Okay.
Yes.
We do.
We do.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you.
The challenges you've been facing. We heard a lot about water. Is there a design flaw somewhere that's causing all this mold infestation? That everybody's, because of something that either the government said, these are the specs, and you put those specs in and they were wrong, or there's something wrong with what you did and it needs to be fixed and remediated. Have you looked at these problems, or are they way more than water?
I can answer that directly, Judge Carter. So the question is, have we identified systemic issues with some of our properties? I can give you an example. My area is Hampton Roads, Virginia, so mostly a Navy portfolio. And one of our neighborhoods, Willoughby, about 385 units, as we were having various issues with the houses usually involving around the ducts. As we opened them up, we identified that there was an installation flaw in the original HVAC system. So these properties were some of the legacy properties that we inherited from the Navy, and realized that every time we looked at one of these vents, essentially it was a gap between the ducting and the actual vent cover. We identified it, we made it a capital expenditure project. It's one that we're undergoing this year, so every time a house comes offline, we do the capital expenditure project and improve the house that way. So if that answers your question.
Judge Carter, if I may, those stories abound. So when we talk about the aging infrastructure and the need to eliminate all of the older homes, it's partly for that very reason. That's not to say that we could not build a brand new home and still have some design issues and some design challenges. But the primary challenge that we've experienced is in that aging infrastructure.
Judge Carter, similarly, I think probably the most prominent location that we have in our portfolio was at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma. And we had issues with new construction and the legacy homes, and the new construction was down to a product defect that we had to remediate. And we remediated that at our cost, and we are in litigation against the manufacturer of that product to try to seek restitution so that we can reinvest those funds back into the project. On legacy homes, in that case, we found that we've had systemic issues with aging HVAC infrastructure, and we've committed to the Air Force to embark upon a plan to remediate all of those issues there. But that's just one example of one base where we've had issues on both new and legacy homes. It's not consistent across all of our portfolio. Obviously, there are some climates that are more that can promote more mold growth because of the climate issues, so where we have those issues, we look, if we have incidents of mold, we look for a pattern of any systemic issues that could be a deeper seated issue that we need to address.
Yeah, thanks, Judge Carter. I won't reiterate what's already been spoken, but obviously it's a combination of aging inventory, climate conditions, etc. I mean, we have a regime that's very clearly communicated at time of move in, move out, that if any resident, for whatever reason, distinguishes mold in the house, to call us and we respond within 24 hours. To give you some sort of context, of our 400,000 service orders, less than 1%, 0.7% relate to mold, lead-based paint, or asbestos in there. So we try to address it. Some of it is aged inventory, some of it is mechanical, as some of the members have said here, but it requires the investment and requires us to turn to try and be more proactive in managing that.
But now lead-based paint would be old homes, not new homes.
Correct.
Surely you're not
correct.
putting
No, that's
lead-based-
pre-1979. I was just saying across lead-based paint and asbestos and mould, less than 0.7% of our service orders are into that bucket.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Mr. Case?
Privatized housing for our military and their families is not just a straight business proposition, because this is a lot more than that. It's about the health and well-being of our families and our service members. But I want to talk from a business perspective here for a second to understand the underlying issues. And so the basic deal here is that you all have an income stream. The income stream is a BAH, dedicated income stream. And in return for that income stream, you're responsible for providing housing, which means that you have an administration cost. You have also a repair and maintenance obligation. You're supposed to take care of the premises, and then you get your profit. Is that about the deal?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and furthermore, to make sure, as I recall, to make sure that you basically didn't skimp on the R&M side of it, the repair and maintenance side of it, we have the reinvestment accounts, which are supposed to be dedicated to repair and maintenance, right? Now, Mr. Burleson, you've spent a fair bit of time talking about those reinvestment accounts, and others of you indirectly referenced to them. You talked about, what was the quote? Leveraging the reinvestment account deposits. You talked about long-term debt. You talked about changing the formula under which the reinvestment accounts are administered. To me, that sounds like a concern over the sufficiency of the reinvestment accounts to take care of sufficient repair and maintenance. And I'm going to go back to the point of the chair, which is, do you believe that those R&M accounts are deficient from the perspective of what you found 10, 20 years later in terms of your R&M obligations for whatever reason, and if so, why? And I'm going to ask you the same question again. Were the projections of where the BAH was going to go over the term of this contract, which is obviously very long contracts, did that turn out to be short. So the fundamental question I've got here is, in the business deal as it exists right now, do you have enough, or are you dedicating enough under your contracts to R&M? Just as a basic business proposition, and if so, should those contracts be changed, either by renegotiations or by some action by Congress?
Congressman, there's a lot there to that question.
Do you have enough in your reinvestment accounts to take care of sufficient repair and maintenance as you project it over time?
In order to maintain where we are today, I believe we do, and I will let the rest of the panelists share their own individual perspectives. The challenge is these homes are continuing to get older and older day by day. And so in order to make some significant and meaningful impacts, we need to deploy as much capital into those homes as we can today, rather than waiting another 5, 10, 15 years through a traditional reinvestment reserve account. That's the reason we moved forward in conjunction with the Army Secretariat to inject the $325 million into the deals. To answer your previous question, or your other question, Congressman, the deals did work on paper when we closed them, 15, 20 years ago. There's been a lot of changes. There's been a lot of evolutions. Some of the BAH projections did not come to fruition. Some other challenges, such as occupancy, expenses, and inflation, some of those things did not come to bear as we had initially projected within the pro formas. We are in earnest right now digging back into each one of the individual project companies' pro formas and determining where are those challenges and what we need to do to overcome them.
Okay, does any of you have an overall different answer? Because I'm focusing on these reinvestment accounts and sufficiency over time. Is that the situation that you all faced? Was it the initial projections really didn't work out over time for various reasons?
Congressman, I'd say from our perspective, we've got 55 different military installations where we have a presence, and it's not a universal story at all of those. There are some projects that are far more financially healthy when we look at the reinvestment accounts. There are some installations where we are going to struggle at the current pace.
And I'm sorry, can I ask you on that question, you talked about vacancy, which I assume means whether families are electing to go outside rather than stay in, or is that about misassessments of R&M obligations over time?
I think that it's less that, because
The latter.
less us missing what the projections were to look like. I think there are a lot of other issues that have contributed to this, and it's locale specific. One of the things that I mentioned in my opening remarks was the need for BAH rate stabilization. When we closed almost every one of these projects, we were at a period where we had zero out-of-pocket as a result of Secretary Cohen's initiative to reduce that out-of-pocket exposure for military families on base and off base to zero. So that was the baseline from which we originally projected these projects were going to operate. Subsequent to that, we've seen BAH drop. So we projected that, from that baseline, we would see moderate growth, 2 to 3% a year, typically for every project. And in many cases, we saw the opposite happen. So that we can't ignore the fact that that's had an impact, that's strained the financial health of projects when you have less income than what was originally projected. That's been a contributing factor. On the operating expense side, we've seen increases in utilities far greater than in some locations than what we could have projected or anticipated. There are many places, if you look at where we're situated, we've been exposed to natural disasters that have exacerbated the financial health of some of the projects. Probably the most noteworthy one for us was at Tyndall Air Force Base that effectively wiped out the base a couple of years ago. And those are things that have a meaningful impact on projects. And so again, I think that those are things that we can't ignore. So I think if we're going to look at the long-term health of this project, I think the first thing we need to fix is the income stream, make it far more predictable, and then we need the ability to kind of return to the old OMB scoring model so that we can go out and leverage additional capital, because that is exactly where many of these projects are going to need to go.
Okay, my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Burleson, you mentioned the 97% satisfaction rate. All of you as businessmen know that data if you got bad data, you got bad results. And I think a lot of what's going on here is we've got bad data. The GAO says, in response to your 3% disapproval or dissatisfaction rate, says that DOD provides reports to Congress on the status of privatized housing, but some data in these reports are unreliable, leading to misleading results. DOD provides periodic reports to Congress on the status of privatized housing, but reported results on resident satisfaction are unreliable due to variances in the data provided to OSD by the military departments and in how OSD has calculated and reported this data. Interestingly, when in the actual report, they say that you assume that the resident is satisfied if they're still living in the residence. Because if they weren't satisfied, they'd move out. But we also know that they can't move out because they're going to continue to pay for it, the BAH, whether they're there or not. How do you use that kind of data to decide satisfaction?
Congressman, with all due respect, the 97%, I believe, was shared by another panelist. We were at 93%.
Okay.
But nevertheless, I
The points that, yeah.
I still get the point.
I got you.
The point remains.
Okay.
So the challenge is, and the challenge has been, I believe some of the data has been accurate, but I believe that the overall sentiments have not been thoroughly expressed. Taken back to the Army survey, just for example, 2019, the spring Army survey of 2019, we had the lowest response rates across our Army portfolio, roughly 15% response rates, where I believe the average was roughly in the 30% range, if not maybe a little bit higher. We took that information and we took the feedback to heart that each of the residents, that 15%, that the information that they were sharing, it was heartfelt. They really took the time to let us know what the challenges were. And Congressman, with all due respect, there were a lot of challenges. And we have been working in earnest as hard as we can to meaningfully overcome those challenges. And I believe we're on the right path, but we're not there yet. There's plenty more to be done, and that's not a soundbite. That's
let me give you another matrix that I think you need to look at. Military departments use performance matrix to monitor private partners, but matrix do not provide meaningful information on conditions of housing. And here's an example. A common indicator is that when they're looking at the condition of housing and the response to maintenance, a common indicator is how quickly the private partner responded to the work order, not whether the issue was ever actually fixed. So you guys need to go back and look at how you're measuring things.
So, Congressman, we are, with respect, we are doing that. Matter of fact, just in the first 2 months of 2020, our work order satisfaction, as soon as the work, let me take another step back. As soon as a work order is completed, we send a survey to the family asking them if they are satisfied with the work that was performed, if it was done to their satisfaction. The first 2 months of 2020, we have seen the highest average that we have over the past 4 or 5 years. It was at a almost all-time low this time last year, quite frankly, and we've seen a steady increase. So it is something that we are working hard to overcome.
You mentioned also that one of the challenges has been occupancy. Well, no wonder. When you look at these numbers, and if you're getting numbers at HQ that's telling you 97% are satisfied, or 93%, whatever number you want to use, you're fooling yourselves. And that's impacting on your occupancy. And so, you know, I want to encourage all of you, go back and look at how you're measuring this stuff, because according to GAO, you're not measuring very well. And it's, you know, your tenants are paying for it.
Congressman, can I offer a comment there?
Mr. Taylor?
The original incentive criteria that were set out in all of our agreements was a construct that was developed when we closed on the projects, and there was a heavy focus on responsiveness to work requests, less of a focus on quality and completeness, and we are constantly meeting with our military partners, and I can tell you that there's a revision across all of the services to put more focus on resident satisfaction, quality and completeness of work, focus on preventive maintenance so that we can address things before they ever become an issue. So we get it.
And
We're
you've been
getting it,
measuring
and
all those things, Mr. Taylor.
Yes, sir.
You've been measuring all those things. You've just been wrong.
There's going to be a greater focus. Like as I
Okay.
said, the incentive criteria are all being revised effective this year, and we are all signing up to that.
Good. And I'm really glad to hear that all of you, now I know you can't speak for everybody, but is it pretty much all 14 private partners believe that we need to put those 3 omissions in the tenant bill of rights? Because I think that's necessary. You know, I can list them for you. The access to maintenance history of the home, a process for dispute resolution, and the ability to withhold rent. Those 3 things, and I think all of you answered the Congresswoman, Chairwoman, yes, correct? And the rest of the industry is on board as well, or? Yeah. Okay, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Chairwoman. You know, we're kind of on the front lines too here because we get the calls. And the sense I'm getting from the people behind you is that your responses aren't adequate. And I will just say, just listening to your opening statement, I think the gentleman at the end was the only one who really said, we failed, and we want to do better, and we screwed up. And, you know, when you sit on this side, and we have to go through excruciating analysis of how we spend the taxpayers' money, and what we spend it on, and we spend it on post-traumatic stress, we spend it on mental health, opiates, trying to make sure that people who work in the VA have the training that they need to deal with these situations that we have had to deal with for the last 20 years. And we have to get calls after spending our time back in our districts talking to these veterans who walk around without legs, people who serve our country in far-flung places that most people don't even know where they are. And we have got to hear stories like the one, you know, we're hearing, the ones we're hearing. It's maddening us. And I'm extremely disappointed because you guys do pretty well. There's $4 billion that goes out the door for this. And we've got our soldiers living with mold, exposing their children. Completely unacceptable. And, you know, I know there's different scenarios. I'd like to just drill down for a couple of minutes on, because I try to picture myself, we got 3 kids. I try to picture myself living in one of these homes with the 17-year-old, 16-year-old, and 5-year-old, and calling somebody and saying, we have mold in our home, and nothing happening. And so, Mr. Burleson, I know there's an issue that's been public with the lawsuits and different things about families who are living in these situations with sewage and mold and lead-based paint and all the rest. When I call somebody in this particular scenario, who do I call and what's their response? Because every one of you said, well, we've got an app now, which is like the answer for everything in America to fix a problem. Well, we've got an app. I call somebody. I'm a dad. I call somebody. Who do I call in this scenario, and what happened? Where was the breakdown?
Congressman, you would call one of our community offices, and one of our resident service specialists would take the information, immediately put it into the system, and based upon the severity of the challenge within the home, there's a certain timeline is established for the team to respond, and they come to your home, do an assessment, evaluate, and we openly communicate what those right next steps are. With all due respect, that's what we're doing today, and that's what we should have been doing all along, and we were doing it at various levels. We had some team members that didn't have the right level of focus, some team members that didn't have the right level of training, and a lot of those folks are no longer with us, quite frankly. So we have put a brand new focus, a renewed focus, on making sure that the teams are trained, and we have really gotten back to that customer-centric approach that we take a lot of pride in.
The taxpayer wants to know how this has been going on so long, and you're just coming around and saying, well, we fixed it. Like, what happened?
Congressman, I'm not saying we fixed it. I'm saying we are in the process.
Well, you have a
of
process now in place that's like when that dad or that mom called that person, what the hell happened? What did they do with that information? I have mold. I have kids. I'm giving it to your community rep. What happened? What did they do? Did they go out for a cigarette break and it lost the paper? I mean, what happened? They're supposed to call somebody, right, to come fix it. And they just didn't call somebody? Like, I'm trying to work with you here.
No,
Help me understand what happened.
I understand and I appreciate that. I think in some cases, residents' concerns and residents' issues and challenges were not taken as serious as they should have been. And I think that's the bottom line. And
So you're telling us that you had people working for you, and this is across the board. I'm pinpointing you on this particular issue because we only got 5 minutes and it gets dispersed if we get too broad. But you're telling me that someone called about mold in their home and you had an employee who didn't do anything about it, just flat out said, this is not a major concern, this is not a major health concern, and I'm going to move on with my day?
I believe in some cases that probably occurred.
How does that happen?
I do not know how that happened. I don't know how that happened. It's unacceptable. I do know that there are a lot of challenges that exist. I do know that we have addressed a lot of the concerns and the challenges prior to some of the hearings that occurred last year, the hearing in February. We did have a focus, but I don't think that the focus was at the right level.
See, I'm just thinking about, because, everybody loves this privatized, see it in the schools, and, people are getting paid, and schools stink, it doesn't matter, there's no accountability, most part. Like, how would you survive in the private sector? Like, without the government contracts? This story spread around Youngstown, Ohio, and it was just straight people pulling money out of their paycheck to go pay for rent or whatever. You wouldn't make it. And that's what's frustrating, is that the argument is we're going to privatize this thing and it's all going to work just beautifully because the government can't do anything right. And so we're going to give it to you folks, you fellas, and make it right. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Appreciate your questions. Ms. Roby.
Thank the chairwoman, and I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Burleson from Corvius and Mr. L. from Hunt, since they are contractors for Fort Rucker and Maxwell Air Force Base, both of which are in my district. And look, I think you're hearing very loud and clear the frustrations coming out of my colleagues. I share a lot of their sentiment, if not all, and I think that's been well established here today. I forgot to push start on my timer. So okay. We don't have the lights in here. It makes it very frustrating. And look, in your testimony, you both acknowledge that you've fallen short in meeting residents' expectations. But you've also made changes to improve the quality, I'm told. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the additional steps moving forward. I think, again, it's been well established here today through members' questioning and testimony where we've fallen short. But I think it's important for us to have a productive conversation on what it looks like moving forward so that you can help my constituents and others that are here present today to know what steps are being taken, specific steps are being taken, and what does Congress need to do to ensure that we don't find ourselves sitting in this room having a similar conversation again. So I'm going to divide the time between the two of you that's remaining and give you that opportunity.
Okay. Thank you, Congresswoman. We've again support the reforms that are outlined in the NDAA and all of the elements of the Resident Bill of Rights. The three elements that have not yet been included, and I emphasize the word yet, because they have been under development for months, and are mostly almost done. So it is the intent to put those into the Resident Bill of Rights, and we support that. All of the, to somewhat respond to the question earlier, again, we can't speak for the other project owners that aren't here, but I can say that all 14 project owners have been putting in their input on those elements of the Bill of Rights. So I think we're almost there. So I think there is round support for it. And I think with the implementation of the NDAA elements, which is taking some time because some of them are pretty big, I think those are going to have significant impacts in 2020. But while all that's been going on at Hunt, we've been working on internal reforms of things we can control. Things like work order consistency across the portfolio. Over 10 to 15 years of closing projects, the documents would evolve a little bit. We wouldn't be using the same set of documents over and over again, and they would vary from service to service. And so there would be variances in how work orders were taken out, what the definition of a response or incompletion was, and those sorts of things. At Hunt, we established a Hunt standard where we've standardized across all of our properties, regardless of service or age, to pick out the most stringent elements of our facilities maintenance plans, management plans, and apply that across our portfolio for consistency from location to location, and improving accountability from top down, because we've now more clearly defined our corporate values for our employees, and we'll be incorporating them into performance reviews all the way from the top down, so that those values are being carried out to deliver a more clearly defined level of what we call 5-star service.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. We've done a lot. There's been a lot of what we refer to as the basic blocking and tackling of customer service that we'd allowed ourselves to get away from. Some things that sound so simple and so fundamental. I answered the question earlier that what would happen if a dad called in about a mold concern, and I said they would call the community center and receive a RSS that is an employee. That's absolutely what will happen today. However, over the past couple of years, that didn't happen. What would happen is if a customer called with a complaint during business hours, it went to a call center, and that call center then routed the information that eventually came back to us. The information could have not been taken down accurately. There could have been some other communication challenges, but we noticed really quick in late 2018, early 2019, that just wasn't a customer-focused opportunity for us to truly engage with the resident. So all of our call centers, all of the call centers have gone away during business hours. So if you have a concern, you're actually able to talk to one of our employees to work through the challenge. That's just one example of that blocking and tackling that we've gotten back to in the basics. As Mr. Ill said, we also fully support, and I've also said previously, we fully support the Resident Bill of Rights and the 3 additional provisions within the NDAA that did not make it to the Bill of Rights. I think those things are going to help, and I think it's a continued push for all of us and a continued focus for all of us. Congresswoman, you asked the question also, what can you do? What can you do to help? While I don't necessarily enjoy sitting here, I do think this is a help. I think it's a big help. I think the more attention we can focus in on what the true issues are and where the true challenges lie, and continue to shine the light where those are so we can all work together to overcome them, I think is really important.
My time is up, but I would just maybe leave you with this. I mean, I think what I've heard you say in the short time that I've been sitting here, and I apologize for jumping in and out, but there are places where it is working, and there are places that have woefully fallen short. And I think sometimes, these things we can be over analytical when we could just take the model of where it's working and then apply that elsewhere. And it's not rocket science. It's people's lives and their quality of life. And we're talking about our service members, families that are already sacrificing so much. And at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. But it seems to me, Madam Chair, that in Congress's oversight on these issues where it is working, we need to take that model and apply it across the board. And I know it probably is not that simple, but it seems to me we could take best practices and amplify that But I do appreciate you being here, and like you said, it's probably not a very comfortable chair to be sitting in right now, but it's important for us to have this opportunity to ask you guys these questions to ensure that we're doing our part as members of Congress. And I appreciate you having this hearing today. And
Thank you,
I
Ms.
went
Roby.
way over my time. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you, Ms. Roby. And it is that simple. It really is. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and gentlemen, thanks for coming in today. We've talked about the Tenant's Bill of Rights. Some of you have referred to it as a Resident's Bill of Rights. Mr. Burleson, I thank you for mentioning that there were things that didn't get included in the latest version of the Bill of Rights that you support, and I want to touch on those things now. And what I'm going to do is Mr. Taylor, if you would pass these out. We've made a list of the things that didn't make it in, and for the record, we're showing a poster of 7 items, and I would ask unanimous consent that this handout be entered into the record.
Without objection.
A week ago, in response to the directives of this subcommittee and the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, Defense Secretary Esper and the Service Branch Secretaries all signed a privatized military housing tenants Bill of Rights. Left off, as we've been discussing, Secretary Esper's list were the following, which were included in the Bill of Rights directive in the NDAA that we passed. The first 3 are listed. The right to receive a maintenance history on a property before signing a lease. Second, the right under certain circumstances to enter into a voluntary dispute resolution process that may reduce rent. And number 3, the right to have housing payments held in escrow pending such a dispute resolution. Would you all be all right with all of those? Let the record reflect that everyone said yes. Did you too, Mr. Gill?
Yes.
Okay, good. And then also left off of Secretary Esper's list were several other key tenant protections included in the bill text of the NDAA that we passed. And 4 of those other protections were a requirement that Military Housing Privatization Initiative, MHPI, management companies like you, reimburse DOD for tenants' medical costs if the companies fail to maintain safe and sanitary conditions in the housing that they manage, and you see that. Number two, a requirement that MHPI companies like you pay reasonable relocation costs if relocation becomes necessary because of health or environmental hazards. Number 3, a mechanism where DOD will withhold incentive fees to the MHPI companies if they fail to remedy health or environmental hazards. And number 4, a prohibition of collecting amounts in addition to rent by the MHPI companies other than for amenities, damages, and non-essential utilities. And these are all spelled out in the handout. Do you all agree to those as well? That's in the text of the NDAA. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I think generally, as they're written here, high level, we agree with. I think the first issue around medical costs requires a lot more detailed implementation process around that, because it's in how this is implemented rather than a single sentence. So the other things, we agree to these. It's the next level of implementation around who's qualified to make that determination, how is that determination made, where does the information come from. It's all of those things that we are working through.
But you agree with the language?
We agree with the intent, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Taylor?
Yeah. And I'll just add to Mr. Hickey's comments. All of these issues are issues that we are in constant dialogue with Department of Defense officials to sort through what that process looks like. because having the language there is important. But what's important for us in our partnership is determining what's the process that we need to take to embed these into our agreements. And that dialogue is ongoing with all 14 project owners.
Right, that's process, but you agree with the intent and the language, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, thank you, and I'm here to tell you, know that this subcommittee, through its continued oversight, will for every remaining year of your 50-year management contracts hold you to these commitments. You understand that, right? Okay. I want to talk about NDAs just for a moment. You can put the poster down. A March 29, 2019 Task and Purpose online news article included a copy of an NDA, non-disclosure agreement, apparently used for the settlement of a base housing tenant claim by Lincoln Military Housing. The NDA was reportedly presented to a resident at Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Base. The agreement read in part, and I'm going to pass this out, and I'd like a unanimous consent to enter this into the record as well.
Without objection.
Taylor, if you pass that out and make sure Mr. Guild gets a copy. It says, residents agree that they will not file or institute any complaint or demand against Lincoln Property Company, Pendleton Quantico Property Management, or in any way participate in the prosecution of any complaint or grievance against Lincoln Property Company in any agency or other forum concerning any allegation covered by this agreement. Residents further agree they will keep the existence of this agreement and its terms and other information concerning it strictly confidential. Residents shall at all times refrain from making any negative, adverse, or disparaging remarks, whether oral or written, and including all internet and social media concerning the residents or any non-disclosure agreement. Well, Mr. Guild, do you currently use NDAs for the resolution of landlord-tenant disputes that were never actually litigated, but that do relate to health and safety issues in base housing?
I can't speak to what issues, but we have used NDAs, and we've used for for mediation with tenants.
The rest of you, is that also true? Do you use NDAs for disputes that were never actually litigated?
No, Congressman, we have used confidentiality agreements on things that are being litigated.
Right.
But only for those matters.
Okay, the rest of you?
Congressman, we do not use NDAs.
Okay.
Nor do we, sir.
Trailer?
In the customary sense that they tend to get used in financial settlements for protection of both parties, we have an occasion in the past.
I'm talking about non-litigated matters. You have, okay? Do you know, okay. Will NDAs for non-litigated matters be used with tenants during the execution of the remainder of your housing property management contract with the Department of Defense? In other words, going forward, you're going to continue to use these things?
We haven't used them to date. We won't use them going forward.
Okay.
We will comply with the terms that are spelled out in the NDAA regarding NDAs.
We will as well.
We'll comply with the NDAA.
We will comply with the NDAA.
But you're going to continue to use them. And boys, you understand my concern here. It's transparency. When something comes up, some dad has mold in the family base housing, privatized housing, and there's a resolution without litigation.
Would the gentleman yield
Yeah, I will
for a
yield.
question?
Yes.
Does the NDAA now prohibit NDAs? Since we're using the same letters, I just want to make sure that I have clarity on the question.
Prohibits them with just the regular lease, but it allows them,
I'm sorry, I think you probably have to come to a mic and answer the question.
The NDAA right now prohibits them explicitly for just a regular lease, signing a lease, going into the agreement. but it does allow them, if the matter is in the courts, and you bring it out of the courts with a settlement.
Okay, so maybe, Mr. Cartwright, you could revise your question so that we understand if they're going to use NDAs that are not prohibited by the NDAA.
Right.
Going forward.
And that is the question. You're going to use them where they're not prohibited?
Mr. Cartwright, I just wanted to clarify that we're not using these going forward regardless of the NDAA.
And I'm glad to hear that, because here's a concern. When some...
Mr. Cartwright, would you mind if every one of them answers that question, please?
Pardon me?
Would you mind if all the companies answer that question?
Yeah, please go ahead, each of you.
We're not prohibited. We may have occasion to, because I understand that there is protections for both parties involved, and there is legal custom to use them on occasion.
Congressman, we do not intend to use NDAs, nor have we in the past.
Right, you said that.
Congressman, we do not use NDAs other than for a litigation settlement. We've said that we won't use it going forward.
Right.
And we have a similar view, and any time that one would be contemplated, we would always do so with the agreement of our military partner.
Here's my concern, is that we need transparency. We have to have transparency. If a little extra compensation is given so that you can get an NDA, that's not protecting both parties, Mr. Ailey. That's protecting the privatized housing company. And it's going to hurt the people who need to know about the mold or the infestation or the paint chips or whatever is wrong that led to the dispute in the first place. That's what I'm talking about. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for your indulgence in me helping you ask questions. We tag teamed the last couple. This entire panel has really been eye-opening and added to my concerns rather than alleviating them. It just shows me, and I think our colleagues, that we have more work to do. We certainly will be taking a look as we prepare the chairwoman's mark for this fiscal year, what we can include to make sure that we ensure that there is more oversight and accountability, and that we don't just trust you, because talk is cheap. I'm a show me person, not a tell me person, and so we're going to make you show us. And we'll work with our partners on the Armed Services Committee, because it seems like the NDAA, the next time we do the NDAA, it probably needs to go a little further in kind of NDAs that we prohibit. So, gentlemen, you all have work to do. Thank you for your testimony and appearing before this panel. We look forward to continuing the dialogue with you and having you update us on the implementation of your improving dramatically, not only the conditions of the facilities that you run, but the responsiveness that you provide to our military families, because they deserve nothing less. So with that, we'll allow for a few minutes to switch out the witness panels, and the subcommittee will stand in recess briefly for that purpose. ladies and gentlemen, if we can proceed a little more quickly because we are going to bump up against votes and I want to make sure we can complete this panel. So if we can move in and out expeditiously, that would be helpful. The witnesses have staff that need to be able to sit directly behind them, so if that has been accommodated, then great. Let's get the other people who want to be in the audience in this hearing to come in quickly and sit down so we can begin.
Daniel?
Yeah.
Daniel and Jason.
Go ahead and send people in. There are a few remaining seats, and then we've got to get started.
Joe Hamill, right there.
Okay, we ready? The subcommittee will come to order. We now welcome our third and final panel. Our witnesses are Ms. Elizabeth A. Field, Director, Defense Capabilities and Management for GAO, excuse me, and Mr. Pete Patuchny, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment. The witnesses are here to provide an update on the Department of Defense's efforts to fully assess the extent and nature of the issues within the privatized military family housing program. In addition, they will provide details on their ongoing actions to remedy the inadequate oversight of the program and their long-term plan to make permanent positive changes to the program. Ms. Field, your full written testimony will be included in the record, and you are recognized for 3 minutes to summarize your remarks.
Thank you. Chairwoman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, members and staff of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on GAO's work assessing the Military Housing Privatization Initiative, or MHPI. Roughly 1 year ago, at the direction of this committee, we began our most recent review of MHPI. In our final report, which will be released later this month, we cite numerous ways in which those living in military privatized housing who experienced problems have felt that their concerns were ignored. These residents told us that they had to submit multiple requests before their issues were fixed, and that they felt they had no advocate or recourse if these problems weren't addressed. In some ways, these problems were perhaps predictable. As Comptroller General Dodaro testified last year, military privatized housing is a classic example in which the government made short-term decisions without thinking through the long-term implications. The idea behind MHPI, as you know, was to leverage private sector financing and expertise to eliminate poor quality housing for military families with less government funding and in less time than could have been done under the traditional military construction process. DoD entered into long-term agreements with the private companies. Both the government and the companies provided financing for each project, essentially forming public-private partnerships. GAO has studied these types of partnerships and determined that in structuring them, great care must be taken to protect the interests of both the federal government and the private sector. What we learned through our audit, however, is that while the MHPI partnerships may have been structured to sustain the financial health of the projects, there was less emphasis on ensuring that the private companies would be held accountable for the condition of the homes they own. For example, the metrics used in the agreements to monitor and incentivize the private companies' performance typically have had very little to do with assessing whether they are maintaining quality homes. Until recent concerns surfaced about the quality of privatized housing, the military departments generally distanced themselves from involvement in daily military housing operations. Staffing levels at some local military housing offices were cut, and military housing officials on the ground didn't always fully exercise all of the authorities available to them. DoD is now taking several steps to rectify these problems. Our draft report also includes a number of recommendations which we hope DoD will concur with and implement as soon as possible. And of course, the fiscal year 2020 NDAA contains a number of additional requirements. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that implementing some of these steps may be difficult and may take time, in large part because of the complexities of the underlying agreements and the number of parties involved. As Comptroller General Dodaro has said, partnerships like MHPI should have a framework for making long-term decisions and trade-offs up front before we embark on these efforts. That did not necessarily happen in the case of MHPI. Now, DoD has an opportunity to consider how it wants the remainder of these long-term agreements to be handled so that everyone's interest is protected, including those of the service members and their families who live in these homes. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Field. Mr. Potocny, you're recognized for 3 minutes to summarize your remarks, and your full statement will be entered into the record.
Thank you, Chairman Wasserman Schultz, Ranking Member Carter, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to be here. By way of introduction, I am Pete Potocny, Acting Assistant Secretary for Sustainment. I'm filling that square since the end of November when Bob McMahon resigned. Seated behind me are my service colleagues, the Assistant Secretaries for Energy, Installations, and Environment in the Services, who have cognizance over our housing, Alex Beeler, Lucian Niemeyer, and John Henderson right there. While it's an honor to be here, the fact that this hearing and others like it are necessary is saddening. I do appreciate, though, the oversight that you're providing today and in the past and in the future, I'm sure. Providing quality housing to our families and members, places where they want and choose to live, is our highest priority. But we simply took our eye off the ball, but this isn't the first time. Congress authorized housing privatization in 1996. Then we had a $20 billion maintenance backlog. 70% of our houses were inadequate by the service's own standards individually. And recapitalization at that rate was insufficient to prevent further degradation. We asked Congress to authorize privatization, and the program was, by all accounts, a success for 20 years. We gained $32 billion in investment with only $4 billion, with only a $4 billion contribution on our part, and our housing dramatically improved. Privatization was, and I believe remains, the right thing to do. But our success allowed us to start focusing on other mission areas. Personnel were cut, training eliminated. To be sure, our housing is in much better condition now than it was previously, but we obviously have much more to do to get us out of where we are right now. It's important to note, we no longer own these houses. That's the definition of privatization, and that allows us to tap private sector capital, the capital that we didn't have ourselves to put in when we were in that backlog. So that's the struggle that we have right now. But I will, and they're not contracts, as many people say. These are ground leases generally. These deals are structured differently. The services took advantage of the authorities they have to structure them what made the most sense for them in their mission areas and frankly, their geography. So we do have authorities, and we're using them as they go forward. I'd argue that it's sad that we have to, again, have hearings like this, but we are getting better, and I believe that's true. And I hope you'll see it. So what are we doing now? We have, and you're hearing that we're improving communications, our transparency. We're instituting hotlines, using town halls. We're adding personnel, hundreds literally. We've published our Bill of Rights and our tenant responsibility documents. We still have a few provisions in the Bill of Rights to go. The Secretary felt we didn't have the unilateral authority to deal with 3 of those, as you've heard ad nauseum today, but we will be working through those, and you heard our privatization project owners or landlords sign up to that. We are improving our inspections, and the NDAA gave us some authorities there. Our medical personnel are tracking issues related to lead and mold and the like. Mold, for instance, is an interesting issue, significant, severe, no national standards. We're wrestling with that as well. We are providing tracking systems for our work orders, or at least our partners are, our landlords. We're standardizing and improving our survey processes so that we have data-driven oversight, which my colleague in the GAO has spent a lot of good time on, and we value what her report says, and I mean that sincerely. And of at least equal importance, and I would argue perhaps of most importance, We're focusing the leadership, the attention of our landlords, our installation commanders and their housing offices, as well as our units to assist the residents in these houses, ensure or achieve the rights that they have. Finally, one last thing. We went after privatization and are maintaining privatization to obtain quality housing for our people. But that's quality housing over the long term. So the financial viabilities of these deals has to be maintained. Otherwise, our landlords can't maintain houses to the standards that we want. So those are the two issues that we're struggling with, is ensuring that they deliver what they're getting paid for, frankly, through the rent that our members pay, but also making sure that those deals remain solvent for the long term. So thank you once again, and I do appreciate this committee's oversight.
Thank you, Mr. Potocny. I have a lot of questions, but I will try to be succinct. It's my impression that the department is woefully undermanned to provide effective oversight of privatized military housing. You alluded to that. Do you agree with that assessment?
And we are adding hundreds of people, yes.
Okay. And so you referenced that you're increasing personnel in offices, I assume, that are charged with oversight of the housing program?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Are there barriers to addressing that issue that Congress can be helpful with in terms of legislative authority or funding? We gave you $140 million last year for privatization support costs and management costs. What are you doing with those resources?
So, ma'am, I think we're spending money on hiring people. I think that, you know, we can talk about data and we can talk about leadership and oversight, and you heard both today, right? You know, I recognize that we need work to do on our surveys, for instance, and GAO has eloquently pointed that out. But the stories that you heard earlier today from residents, you don't really need data to figure out that there's a problem there, okay? And so that's where I'm coming from, is the leadership that we kind of got away from, we need to re-exercise, re-execute, and it's that attention that we have to do. And that's what I'm here to tell you that we're trying to do, and the people behind me as well.
Good, I certainly hope so. DOD has provided periodic reports to Congress on the privatized housing program, but the reported results on resident satisfaction really have been misleading or unreliable. You know, Ms. Field referenced that because there are issues in the military department's collection of the data and in OSD's calculation and explanation of the data. So how are we supposed to be able to evaluate and make decisions on the MHPI program with faulty data? And we have to be able to trust the information that you're giving us, or why would we have you report?
Fair question. We've got a lot to do on data. In my view at least.
I mean, but was it fudged?
No.
I mean, what was it? There's really smart people at DOD. I mean, it is really difficult for me to absorb that. I mean, data is data. And I know it can be interpreted any way that somebody chooses to serve their interests. And I am not suggesting that the DOD or the military leadership had anyone else's interests in mind other than military families, but it is hard to understand how we could have not gotten accurate evaluation of data and misinformation.
Once again, ma'am, fair question. But what I'd argue is, well, we sure as hell didn't do a great job, and we're trying to do better, and I'm the first one to admit that. But were we managing these projects with that data, or were we allowing our privatization landlords, our project owners, to manage their projects as they see fit, since they own those houses?
Mm-hmm.
So we weren't using data to manage with. We're starting to collect it now, and frankly, we got off to a pretty rocky start, at least in my view, and I think your comments underscore the fact that you and others in the GAO feel the same way. But we weren't managing with that data originally. We were looking at the whole privatization approach was to provide this housing through the private sector, because that's what they do for a living, not us. We're not the Department of Housing.
Mm-hmm.
So we and it frankly worked for quite a while. we kind of we took our eyes off that bubble. We worried about other mission things and functions. We're back there now. But to answer your question directly is we weren't managing with that data, but we were going to start.
Make no mistake, they took their eye off the ball too, and I asked them a question about how they could have gotten their job so wrong.
Yes, ma'am, I think that's fair.
Is the Office of the Secretary of Defense providing policy guidance or proposed changes? It was the previous panel of private companies, one of them in particular, mentioned the BAH and the need for potential increase in the BAH, really specifically related to the variation in housing. He didn't mention this, but I want to ask you about the variation in housing costs by location. I mean, we as members of Congress, depending on where we live and the district that we represent, the cost of living is higher. So some of us get a little bit higher MRA than other members do to account for those costs. In regions where housing costs are high, the BAH for junior service members doesn't seem to be sufficient to afford their housing. That makes no sense. Is there any effort or thought process to considering whether there is a location factor in the BAH?
So, ma'am, our BAH is dependent upon surveys that are conducted locally. All right, so we peg our
surveys that ask what?
Oh, so not my responsibility. It's in personnel and readiness, but I understand a fair amount about it. Is they will survey a local area for housing that is available to our members, suitable housing, and they essentially average the cost of that, and that's what determines BAH rates, basic allowance for housing rates.
Okay, I mean, I would really suggest that, given that it's not in your job description.
Well, no, we have to pick up the pieces for it. Excuse me. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, I think really it has to go back you have to go back and look at how you are calculating it. Because, as we've referenced to private all the way through this hearing, on a private salary in a more expensive location without the proper evaluation of what true housing costs are in a community and a BAH to match, then it's really unfair because they have to pay the rent regardless, and then they don't necessarily have the resources to do that.
Okay, so
And then the companies also don't have the resources to make sure that in the private market they can generate enough capital.
right. So so a couple of things in that regard. One is I think our surveys are pretty good for assessing what the cost of housing is in a local community. By the way, only 30% of our people are in privatized housing. 70% of our families are out in town. All right, so they're absolutely dependent on basic allowance for housing. But the other piece, and what I heard listening to the earlier panels on TV, is the fluctuation in the bar rate, and that makes it difficult because, again, the foundation of housing privatization was the access to private sector capital. And so if bar rates are fluctuating, then it makes it more difficult to project what their income stream is based on. And so that's what I thought I heard today, and I think that absolutely does bear scrutiny. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired. Judge Carter?
When this all started, I thought the soldier owned the house. He doesn't, does he?
No, sir.
So it's just
It's a rental unit.
big rental project.
Yes, sir.
Is there an insurance? Is there some kind of insurance to cover homeowners?
Well, as I understand it, the tenants can take out renter's insurance, and then the partners have their own insurance as well.
But they do have insurance to cover this.
I believe, yeah.
Did y'all build into your contract any penalties for failing to manage appropriately?
So we have incentives to manage appropriately, and incentives that you
That's
don't.
more money. And if they don't, if you're getting bad reports that don't look like make it look like they're doing a good job, and they're putting the data in the reports, then they're getting a raise when they ought to probably be getting a cut.
Yes, sir. That could be. I think that the intent originally was to have these houses be competitive with the outside. So members would, we were hoping members would want to live and choose to live on base. But if they chose not to, then they had the option of going off base, and they absolutely still do that. But there is frankly, a special category. We're not the subject of this hearing isn't the housing out in town. It's the housing that we have on our base.
Yeah, that's right.
So it is essentially, it's a third class of housing. We have government-owned housing, primarily now overseas, military housing privatization initiative housing, which is what we're talking about, and then plain old housing on town.
Thank you.
Mr. Case?
Thank you. Were you able to listen to the prior testimonies?
Sorry, I heard almost all of it. The last 15 or 20 minutes, we were lined up outside, so we didn't hear
Okay.
it.
I was just struck by the conclusion that the original contractual projections hadn't panned out and that R&M suffered for it. What do you think about that? I asked about, okay, you got your income stream, your BAH. The panelists actually said that their projections, their original projections, were not sufficient for various reasons. Some had to do with BAH being reduced and/or stabilized. It wasn't growing at the 2% over time that they projected at the beginning of the contracts. In some cases, there was vacancy because perhaps a greater number of folks chose to live off base. They had issues having to do, and then on the expense side, the operations and administration costs were higher because of unanticipated disasters. I just, and then I listened to really the underlying business requests, which were basically let us get more capital into the projects in order for, R&M, I hope, rather than, operation, administration, and/or profit. I mean, the whole idea here is sufficient reserve accounts to take care of R&M and not shortchange it. And yet I felt, and then the conclusion that I kept on coming back to was that because the contracts hadn't worked out as projected 10, 20 years later, R&M had suffered for it. Do you feel that?
Sir, I don't see it. No, I don't. But I can't say. There's 79 projects, right, and in a variety of areas spread across the United States. And we've had, it's not just members perhaps choosing to live out in town as opposed to on base. We've also had, in some cases, force structure reduction, so there's less people on that base. And so now, therefore, there's less of a tenant population. And so some of our projects are using what's called the waterfall chart to allow others, DoD civilians and others on a hierarchy, to occupy those houses to keep the cash flowing in these deals to ensure that we have quality housing. But to answer your question directly, a 50-year deal is tough to project, but I think the pro formas were pretty good, but things have changed. Sometimes on our part, again, if there's been a force structure reduction, or perhaps we're looking to have, say, a capitalization happen on a quicker scale, all right, than maybe the 20 years that perhaps was originally forecast, and we'd like it quicker because it's just what we do these days. So that would change the nature of the deal, and so we'd have to look at them. But I think that our members, our project owners went in with eyes open. This is what they do for a living, and we're trying to hold them to it unless there are extraordinary circumstances. And then, because it is a partnership, frankly, we need to look at those deals.
Well, 50 years is a long time to project. But when you get out 50 years in a contract, then you tend to project a little more conservatively because there's more, variables over a longer period of time. And so here's, we can sit here and dwell all the time we can about, what was then and did it work out. And I think it's instructive to ask the question of whether, in fact, the R&M side is not getting sufficient attention because the financial projections are squeezing these companies. However, I think it's probably more constructive to ask the question, okay, what do we do about it? Because the companies came in with some very concrete, business projection-related suggestions, such as changing the deposits, how the deposits are leveraged, long-term debt provisions. Are you engaged in, and by the way, the backdrop to that is I'm also asking myself, well, do we bail them out if that's really what's going on? Is that our responsibility, or was that a risk that they assumed so that it should really come out of their profits, as opposed to us saying, well, okay, fine, you can create a little bit more of a risky capital infusion strategy than we held them to at the very beginning. So that's the context for my question, but my direct question is, do you feel that we should, in fact, change some of these requirements to allow them to invest further capital into their companies, and I would assume that would be for the very specific reason of freeing up much more money for a straightforward R&M.
I think on a case-by-case basis, yes. And I think the people sitting behind me are faced with that question and looking at each one of these deals individually to see where it's appropriate and where it's not. And sometimes it's an R&M issue, as you mentioned. Other times it could be something else, like a hurricane or something that devastates the place.
Okay, thank you very much. I should have deferred to you as well.
Thank you. Just very briefly, we did issue a report back in 2018 on MHPI, looking particularly at the financial health of the projects. One of our findings was that while there was a pretty good system and process for looking at the financial health of the projects in the short term, there wasn't necessarily a good system in place for determining their financial viability over the long term. So we made a recommendation to the department that they update their guidance to have a better system in place to do that. I believe that recommendation is still open, so we hope that the department will implement it in short order.
Do I have time for a follow-up, or am I? Okay. A number of those companies said, quote unquote, stabilize the BAH income stream. And I don't know whether that meant, I didn't have a chance to ask them whether that meant increase it or it meant stabilize it. What's your view of what the issue is here? And if so, what is your view of what we should do? And I agree. I mean, it's hard to operate a business enterprise with an inconsistent and unpredictable income stream. That's why you're conservative about it if you're in a 50-year level. But what should we do to give them a fair, stabilized income stream that they actually can project out with?
So first, I want to acknowledge that we just initiated a new audit looking particularly at the BAH and how it is calculated. We would be happy to brief your staffs on that audit as we proceed with it. I think the issue that a number of people have raised with the BAH is that because of the way it is calculated, even if the percentage of overall rent and utility that it represents goes down, the actual number of BAH, depending on the location, can fluctuate wildly. It can go way up, it can go way down. It's not clear sometimes that the BAH really is the appropriate number for the locality that it is designated for. So I think the first piece of thing that we need to do here is figure out exactly how it is calculated and why. And so that's what we're hoping to get at with our audit.
None of the contracts have a guaranteed minimum currently for BAH. They all float right at whatever the BAH is.
I believe that's correct.
From what I understand is they projected, say, a 2 to 3% increase in BAH over the life of it. I don't, we reduced BAH a few years ago by 5%. And so, but again, I was talking with my hands earlier when I went like this, sorry. It's the fluctuations that I hear the project owners are concerned about, because it's that cash flow that even if it goes up, they're not necessarily happy. Economists like to have a nice steady growth. That's what they're looking for too. And when it goes up and then goes down, it's kind of hard to plan.
Well, that's what a reserve account is for. So that's
true. But in the first place, though, why can't it be a little bit more gradual?
Thank you.
As a person who talks with my hands too, I feel your pain. Thank you. Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if you mentioned this in your remarks, I'm sorry, because I was in another meeting. But I'd like to ask the three omissions out of the Tenant Bill of Rights. Where's OSD on that, and why were they not included?
So, getting back to what this is all about, the access to private capital, right? Those three, the Secretary of Defense deemed shouldn't be the subject of unilateral action for us to do it by, using the authority Congress gave us, and just to do it by fiat was to work with the privatization project owners, and that's what we're doing right now. You heard them today, and we'd heard them as well say that they can accept them. We just need to work out the details, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay, so we can expect those three
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
to be rolled back in at some point?
That's right.
Okay. And Ms. Field, when you were talking about the study on the impact of the BAH, you're taking into account the force reduction issues and movements and that kind of thing that was talked about earlier, right? what,
I think the two issues are related, so certainly we will look at how there is an interplay between the BAH calculation and how it fluctuates, as well as circumstances aside from the BAH that could have an impact on the financial health of the program, such as unforeseen events like a severe weather event or a reduction in force.
okay. Do you see ways that the installation commanders can get more involved, or can you talk a little bit about that? They don't seem to be quite as able or engaged as I think they should be. What's GAO's position on that?
So absolutely, that's a great point. We visited 10 installations as part of our audit, and one of the things that we observed at basically every location was that the military housing offices on the ground were in part understaffed. They all said they were overwhelmed. There were inconsistent oversight practices occurring. For example, only pulling just a very few number of work order records to analyze them, only visiting a few homes in annual compliance visits. I do understand that the military departments have updated their guidance to ensure that commanders on the ground, as well as their military housing offices, are taking steps to strengthen their oversight. One of the recommendations included in our draft report, which again I hope the department will concur with, is that the Office of the Secretary of Defense issues some guidance to the military department so that it is standardized across the board, and so that it is clear that the expectation from the Office of the Secretary of Defense is that this oversight be strengthened and be sustained over the long term.
Good. And I want to appreciate the work that GAO did on looking at the matrices that these private providers are using, because I think that's part of how we get to this place where things are so bad, because the data that they're looking at tells them things are okay, and it's really not.
Yes, and I think part of the problem here is that the data are not necessarily data that are maintained by the companies. They're also data that are collected and used by OSD. And some of the problems that we found had to do with data collected at that level. We also found problems with the metric, and you alluded to this earlier, problems with the metrics that are contained in the legal agreements that inform the performance incentive fees, which Judge Carter mentioned. There are a lot of problems with those as well. So these are tricky problems that will take some time to be fixed.
But we're working on those now.
I believe the Department of Defense is working on them, yes.
So let me add to that, sir. So yes, to everything you said, the key, and I alluded to this before, is that we can have data to manage this overall, which we absolutely need, and we have to do a better job at it. But also at the local level, at the base level, the installation commanders, as
Right.
you said, that's where those installation commanders, their housing offices, the units that those members are part of we need to make sure that they are actively engaged in ensuring that our privatization project owners are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Agreed. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank both of our witnesses for being here. In particular, thank you to the GAO for jumping on this after the Reuters reports and after we were starting to make noise about it in this subcommittee. It's very, very helpful that the GAO has got involved. I want to, the two subjects I want to cover are the Tenant's Bill of Rights Mr. Rutherford was talking about, and also non-disclosure agreements. First, the Tenant's Bill of Rights. I'm sorry, I didn't fully catch the full discussion, but Mr. Rutherford was asking about three things that were left off the Tenant's Bill of Rights. What were those three things that you were talking about?
The 7-year maintenance history, it was the dispute resolution, and rent withholding.
Okay. Now, those were included in the NDAA language, were they not? And the way you talked about them just now, it sounded like they were optional.
No, I didn't say they were optional. Sir. What I said is the Secretary of Defense felt that they were not subject to unilateral action for us to do it immediately. We're working with partners to arrive at procedures that will allow us to fulfill those three.
Well, okay, let's unpack that a little bit, if you don't mind. When you say we're working with partners, you're talking about a tenant's bill of rights. You're not talking about working with tenants. You're talking about working with the landlords, right?
So, sir, if we...
It's a yes or no question. Okay, well, here's the thing. You're talking about how to implement these things with the landlords. And this is not a suggestion. It's not optional in the NDAA. It is mandatory on the Department of Defense to start implementing these things.
Yes, sir.
So why would the landlord's opinions or desires or wants have anything to do with that? DOD's been instructed to include these things in the tenant's Bill of Rights.
Yes, sir, we will. So here's we are doing it. We are working with our privatization partners for a process that will allow them to deliver on the commitment that is in the tenant Bill of Rights, because if we were to post those right now and include those, we wouldn't have a means to fulfill that promise to our residents.
What's the timeline? What's the timeline?
Well, I don't have one, but I think it's going to be pretty quick.
What's pretty quick for you, sir?
Well,
May
May 1st.
1st?
But you're going to hold me to it. Sorry, I'm going to tell you this. I'm trying like...
That's what we get paid to do, oversight here. All right, let's move over to non-disclosure agreements. The way the NDAA works is that non-disclosure agreements are prohibited at the beginning of a lease. You can't just hand over an NDA and expect the new tenant to sign it. They are allowed if there's litigation and to wrap up litigation, and we've all seen that, and we get that. But where a dispute arises short of litigation, that's kind of a gray area, and I want to get your input on it, Mr. Potocny. Do you see those as allowable?
Only after this suit is filed, as I understand it.
Only after the suit is filed?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but that's what I understand it to be.
So if it came to pass that a tenant who had raised a complaint but had not filed a suit or started a claim, a formal claim, a tenant raised the problem and was presented with an NDA, that would be a violation. Is that correct?
I believe so.
All right. Do you want to weigh in on that, Director Field?
I would
Mr.
just note
Cartwright
that
has about 1 minute left.
I would just note that when we went to the 10 installations that we visited, we conducted focus groups with residents. The issue of NDAs did come up in a few of them, sometimes secondhand or third hand, but there was a concern about the potential use of NDAs inappropriately. I do think that the military departments may have issued guidance on the use of NDAs recently, which would be a positive step if I'm correct that that has happened.
Mr. Potocny, would you agree with me that a non-disclosure agreement in general could contribute to delay in addressing housing problems in the private management companies?
I guess in some circumstances, they absolutely could.
Sure. Will you tolerate NDAs being required in non-litigated matters of your service members in the future?
No.
It's a right answer. Let the record reflect the witness said no, and we're satisfied with that. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Before we wrap up, Mr. Rutherford, neither Mr. Rutherford nor Judge Carter have an additional question. Ms. Field, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. A common failing across the services has been indifferent or non-existent command involvement in housing management at the installation level, which Mr. Potocny has acknowledged here today. What is GAO looking at in terms of the recommendations you're making to ensure installation commanders are informed, empowered to act, and motivated to intervene on behalf of military families? Because Colonel Gerber, I think it was Colonel Gerber in our first panel, who talked about how busy the folks in the chain of command are, understandably so, and they don't have a ton of time to be worrying about the nitty-gritty of the housing challenges of their troops. And, a private versus a colonel getting the attention of their, supervisor, of the person in the chain of command above them and on up the chain, is somewhere between slim and none. So how do we deal with that?
So I think that the tone needs to come from the top, the very top, and that's why one of the recommendations in our draft report is that the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Potocny's office, issues guidance to the military departments to ensure that their oversight and their expectations for the commanders on the ground is clear and robust. One of the things that we do at GAO routinely is follow up to see if our recommendations are being implemented and if they're being implemented well, and we will certainly do that in this case. I think one other point I want to make is that in the case of the Army, I believe it was 2013, guidance was actually sent out saying that installation commanders should not perform physical inspections of homes. The tone at the top in that case was, this is not your problem, this is not your job. So that is, I think, an important example of why we think strengthened guidance is so important. I should note that that decision has been since reversed.
Oh, thankfully. Okay, good. We haven't talked much about lead today, and I do want to ask you both about lead. There are incoming tenants that are often presented with lead and mold addendums, and the manner in which these issues are presented and discussed prior to move-in is inconsistent across the services. So that leads to confusion and the inability to make an informed decision. Is DoD considering standardizing those lead and mold addendums? Because it makes no sense to deal with them differently across the services.
So I believe so, ma'am. And the reason why I'm saying I believe so is the medical community within the department is doing a lot on making our tracking and the information we're providing people to be consistent across the department. So so the medical piece of it, yes, they are on track.
I'm talking about the addendums themselves.
Well, then what we're looking for then is, as well, is on something we do control here, and the people behind me is having a uniform lease and consistent policies across.
Because there's not one now.
No, there isn't, and so we're working on that.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to make sure that I brought that out publicly. And is there, I mean, given the risk of lead exposure associated with inadequate maintenance on housing built before 1978, is there a plan to phase out those properties or conduct full lead abatement as a more permanent remedy? And is that a recommendation of GAO?
We have not made a recommendation related to phasing out properties, in part because that was outside of the scope of our audit, in part because that would have a financial impact on the projects. The one note I would make about lead, which I think is just as important as the legal addenda, is the issue of how we know where there are issues with lead or mold. And one of the things we wanted to do as part of our audit was figure out what the prevalence was of some of these hazards. What we found is that the data that the partners maintain simply aren't reliable for doing that. So one of the recommendations in our draft report is that the department set some standard expectations for the companies in terms of the data that they maintain.
And is that being done, Mr. Potocny?
I believe so, but I
Do you have a
can't
plan
say-
to phase out the
but
properties or conduct
not
a
phasing
full
out the
lead
property.
abatement?
So their lead abatement procedures are something everybody deals with, and they're subject to state and local provisions as well as federal. So to the extent that lead is present, but it's not a danger, and there's processes and procedures for determining that, I can take that one for the record, what exactly are. You know, we're following those. And if the lead presents any danger, yeah, it has to be remediated, absolutely.
Well, we've just heard reports of lead paint being just painted over, and other, pretty horrific descriptions of how lead abatement has been dealt with. And so I don't really get the sense from the feedback that we've been getting and the documentation that's been made by Reuters and others that there is an appropriate lead abatement process in place. And I mean, seems like a more permanent remedy than what is currently being utilized is essential.
So I believe
lead is
huge,
extremely dangerous.
Huge, absolutely, and asbestos as well.
And the damage is irreversible in a human.
Well, the chair, that was the question
Yes,
I
I'd
was
be
going to
happy to
ask.
yield.
You got asbestos too, don't you?
Mm-hmm, asbestos
I'm
too.
going to bet in the old houses before '77, I think it was, or whatever the year was. So absolutely, I'd rather, if I could, take for the record what we're specifically doing. But I'm going to tell you though is with the exception of some stories like we heard this morning, somebody didn't do their job. So I can't claim we're perfect, but I think we have pretty good processes in place, and I can provide those to you.
Okay, that's not what I don't mean what we heard this morning. There is pretty widespread complaints and concerns about the way lead is being handled and the fact that there are folks moving into homes where they are not adequately notified about the lead that was there. It is discovered while they're there after a lengthy experience, which results in irreversible health damage to their family members. I mean, and it's not an anecdotal thing, it's a well-documented thing. And so if you could answer for the record what your plans are to change the way you approach the lead that is in properties that you currently are responsible for or that have been taken over by privatized housing.
Yes, ma'am, I'll get back to you.
Thank you. Okay, any other members have any questions? Okay. Yeah. With that, I want to thank the witnesses. We have you all have a lot of work to do, and I appreciate your forthright responses, Mr. Patuchny. That's refreshing and helpful, because we can certainly move forward a lot more easily than if we were really in a tussle this afternoon. So we are only at the beginning of our oversight role here. We plan to, as I said in all the panels, at the end of all the panels, when we prepare the chairwoman's mark, we fully intend to make sure that we inject some oversight, a lot of which will be from the GAO's recommendations, and we appreciate, Ms. Field, your work and the work of your colleagues, because it helps us be able to make sure that we have an in tandem operation of oversight and implementation, so that we don't just do this and keep spinning our wheels. So with that, the subcommittee is adjourned, subject to the call of the chair, but we will meet tomorrow. Our next hearing is tomorrow at 10:30 in the morning with the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. We stand adjourned.